All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I want to defend the truth of Gary's legacy as an honest and brilliant scholar, probably the world's most famous and knowledgeable resurrection expert. So, as my audience will probably know, the atheist YouTuber Paulogia has recently posted his latest video attacking Dr. Gary Habermas's scholarship and his Magnum Opus, specifically his Volume 3, on the scholarly perspectives and what he calls his quote unquote round 3 response.
And that video of Dale and Gary is what has us gathered together today. To help everyone keep track, I'm calling that interview and this response Round 3. Round 1 was a multi-apologist release party to celebrate Gary's third volume and my initial fact-checking of those claims. Round 2 was Gary's multi-platform book publicity tour, where he faced questions about my fact-checking. And now we have Round 3, where Gary backtracks even further in the wake of pushback from Round 2.
Now, the problem here is that many of the fundy atheists and skeptics who are fans of Paulogia have basically fallen for Paulogia's propaganda, and they are supporting the persecution against Gary and his good name. And they've all band together to claim Gary's a liar or he's a lunatic, he's losing his mind, and stuff like this.
I'm actually want to get to the end of this because I think I know why Habermas is doing what he's doing, and it's dishonest as hell. The fact that he's appearing with Turek kind of tells me all I need to know. So, but there's that. Yeah. I think he's trying to make a buck. I did notice something else, Anne-Marie. If you go to Amazon right now, all of Habermas's the 3 volumes that are out are on 50% sale. And that tells me something. I'm wondering if the reason he's reacting to Paulogia and me and a few others so harshly is we're pointing out as people who don't have terminal degrees what this is, which is bullshit. That is straight up dishonesty by Habermas. Habermas should have mentioned the fact, like, he is completely misrepresenting this part.
Now, originally, I was rather unconcerned with this. This is what we would expect from the godless. Atheists and skeptics are devoid of the Holy Spirit. They don't have common decency and morality when they're so hard of heart, at least. Obviously, I'm not making a universal claim. There are a lot of atheists and skeptics who I have respect for, and they're not as far gone as atheists like Paulogia or the Rabyd Atheist. And rather than responding directly to the atheists and skeptics, look, me and Gary did an interview show already responding to that. They had their chance and they blew it. They're not interested in the truth. They just want to discredit and destroy Gary Habermas as a person and a scholar. And they're willing to distort the truth in all sorts of ways to do that. They're beyond hope at this point. I'm not worried about them or concerned about them. But I do still have hope for my Christian brothers and sisters that maybe we can reason together and they'll see the truth if I address their objections. So that's going to be the focus of this show, an earnest and sincere reply to hopefully change the minds of some of the Christians who've fallen for Paulogia's propaganda. So the first thing we have to do is, well, what are some of the complaints that the Christians have raised based on Paulogia's latest video, starting with Dr. Lydia McGrew? What is the problem here that she sees with Gary Habermas? So she says, quote unquote, "It pains me to have to say this, but this video by YouTube skeptic Paulogia is at least mostly correct and extremely damning. I've now watched or read the transcript for much of it, though not quite all. At a couple of points, Paulogia plays clips of my criticisms of Habermas." And that's one thing I just want to point out. With Lydia, she doesn't really watch the videos. She just reads the transcripts. And because of that, there could be some context I think she's missing out on. It helps when you're visually watching and listening to the videos itself. So that might account for part of why Lydia is taking the take that she does. But anyways, Lydia goes on. And note, I am reading everything in full context. There's no, unlike Paulogia and the Rabyd, I don't twist the truth and manipulatively edit things out of context to fit some point that I'm making. I'm reading everything in full. You'll have the full context, okay? Because I trust my audience to be real seekers, and I trust the Christians who are believing Paulogia, Lydia, David, Colton Carlson, Jonathan McLatchy. I trust and respect you guys to be interested in the truth as well, and to be real seekers of that truth. Anyway, so Lydia goes on, but Paulogia also discusses something that I hadn't previously been following: Habermas's blatant goalpost shifting just within the past 6 months on how many Christian versus non-Christian scholars are cited in Volume 3 of his Magnum Opus. The question itself is a little odd, and I don't even entirely understand why Habermas made such a big deal about it, since in this case it wasn't about how many scholars in various camps hold a particular view, which has been the subject of her own fact-checking on Habermas's interpretations, and we'll get to that later on in this series. But merely how many scholars are cited in Volume 3 for any view, whether positive or negative. I guess it was just supposed to show how thoroughly Habermas has made himself aware of scholarship or something. Anyway, I've now been checking, and Paulogia is right. Habermas has engaged in the most jaw-dropping goalpost shifting in interviews just in the last 6 months. He really did, first, very explicitly claim that he counted and that there were more non-Christian than Christian scholars as individuals whose views are represented in Volume 3. Then he shifted to more non-evangelicals than evangelicals. And then in a third position, he shifted very radically to more citations of non-evangelicals than of evangelicals, and even called it superficial to count the number of individuals. This is nuts. This looks terribly dishonest. Lydia goes on. My only quibble so far with Paulogia's interpretation is that it looks to me like the shift from evangelical and non-evangelical people to citations of evangelicals versus non-evangelicals may have already been occurring in Habermas's discussion with Mike Licona 2 months ago. In other words, in what Paulogia calls round 2. And she's correct on this. I'm gonna provide proof later on that actually, yeah, there aren't these 3 rounds. There's only 2 rounds of a switch. But I'll get in when I get to my assessment. Lydia is assuming this switch was deceptive on Gary's part. I'm going to prove that's not the case. But going on with her quote for now, Habermas's discussion with Mike Licona, whereas Paulogia seems to think that he only made this radical shift from individuals to citations 1 month ago in his most recent Real Seekers interview. But the fact that he made the shift is the important point, not whether it was 1 month ago or 2 months ago. As I say, I'm not even sure why this particular question is important, but the fact is that Habermas made a big deal about it initially in advertising his Volume 3, and now he's gaslighting about what he originally said. One thing I'll just clarify here quickly, Gary Habermas didn't make any big deal about this. So this is not true from Lydia, but it was one of these skeptical objections raised by Paulogia and others, and therefore I wanted to address it. And Gary was kind enough to address it in my interview from about a month ago that we did together. That was me that put that in the list of questions, not Gary Habermas. So he's not making a big deal about this. Anyways, Lydia goes on, and there's more. In his most recent attempt at damage control 1 month ago on Real Seekers, that's me, Habermas discussed a point that is much more important to his method, namely his claiming for decades that he has the receipts showing that a vast majority of scholars endorse his minimal facts, but more recently saying that he never did a head count. This is a truly wild backtrack, which I myself have talked about on my YouTube channel, because that started over a year ago in conversation with Mike Licona. There are 3 new things in this 1 month ago interview with Real Seekers, which I just learned about because it's referenced by Paulogia. First, he very explicitly says that he just gave his opinion off the top of his head, but what percentage of scholars grant a fact? That's a pretty wow admission that we already knew about, but worded it in yet a new way that makes the sheer sloppiness that lay behind these claims all these years even more evident. Yet Habermas is totally unabashed when he says it. Second, he says that he thinks he only gave the 90-something% definition of vast majority in one place, though there may be more. There are, in fact, multiple places where he gives that minimum, and one of them is right in Volume 1 of his Magnum Opus, which was only recently published. Third, and to my mind, one of the worst, he tries to make a bogus distinction between a prescriptive and a descriptive use of a vast majority threshold, and that he's merely said things like, I wouldn't be surprised if it were over 90%. This is absolutely false. Habermas has said again and again that it is a requirement for something to be a minimal fact that it must be affirmed by a vast majority of scholars. In fact, he's even prided himself on not counting the empty tomb as a minimal fact because it's affirmed by a mere 75%. So whatever the vast majority requirement is, it was always presumably notably more than 75%. To be sure, he could have chosen to use some number short of 90% as the definition of the vast majority, if he wished to do so, and he may have chosen 90% after getting that impression from his informal literature survey. But he has never treated being affirmed by a vast majority of scholars as an optional part of his method, as something he's merely noting as an interesting observation, or anything like that. Being affirmed by a vast majority has always been one of the two necessary criteria, and yes, he uses the word criteria right in Volume 1, for being counted as a minimal fact, in the only sense that counts, that is, prescriptive. For him to claim otherwise is a shocking sophistry. Lydia concludes her post. I'm terribly sorry to have to say this, but I don't even see how some sort of mental failure can be the best explanation of what's gone on with these matters in this past year. If Dr. Habermas has the mental wherewithal to give these interviews and to come up with these goalpost shifts and gaslighting about his own claims, even in his own most recent publications and in other recent interviews, how can he not be held responsible for them? All right, so I read all of Lydia's posts there in full context, and we are going to be addressing these. Thankfully, Lydia at least provides substantive reasons. Unfortunately, the other Christians here don't really provide reasons. They're kind of relying on Lydia McGrew and or just sort of their impression from what Paulogia's video left them with. Nonetheless, so here's the next one, David Paulman. And again, David Paulman, like Lydia McGrew, is a personal friend of mine. I respect the heck out of him, just like I do with Lydia. They're both true Holy Spirit-filled Christians and scholars that deserve our respect, just like I would say Gary Habermas deserved their respect, and Mike Licona deserves their respect as well. Anyways, David Paulman, here's what he says, a lot shorter, but he cites the Paulogia video here, and he says, quote unquote, the evidence has become ever more clear and abundant that Gary Habermas is simply unreliable. I don't know if he's lying or if he's just old and careless, but whatever the explanation is, it's time for Christian apologists to realize that the claims that he makes, especially those pertaining to what most scholars believe or accept as fact, cannot be uncritically accepted. While I have plenty of gripes with Paulogia, this video is just the latest example of receipts showing why Habermas cannot be trusted. And again, seeing these Facebook posts, when I saw these, again, when I saw Apologia and the comments from the Rabyd Atheist and all these atheists and skeptics, they were meaningless to me because they're just biased. They're entrenched in their hatred of Gary and Christianity and frankly Christ, the King, and so they want to serve their master, Satan. They want to discredit the truth in any way they can. But the same can't be said about these Christians, who I believe are true Christians. They're sincere here in what they're saying, and they have the Holy Spirit. So obviously, that's why I felt it's so important to do this video defending Gary one last time, but with focus on the objections from the Christians. Gary and I already did our interview and our response show, responding to Paulogia and Rabyd Atheist and all the other atheists and skeptics. Those answers stand, and they're great answers. Whether Paulogia buys it or not, that's his problem, kind of thing, right? But what it does bother me when fellow Christians are buying the Paulogia propaganda and calling Gary dishonest, and using my video, as Paulogia did, my interview with Gary, which Gary, it was his idea to do that show, and very kind of him to put himself out there. A lot of apologists would say, "Oh, just ignore Paulogia and he'll go away. We don't even need to bother responding to the skeptics to begin with." Gary put himself out there and said, "No, you, Dale, I'm going to trust you to gather all these skeptical objections from all the various skeptics," which included Paulogia and the Rabyd Atheists. We weren't avoiding them. We did scholars and laymen. I did everyone I could find who had any kind of objection to Volume 3 or Gary's scholarly consensus criterion. And we addressed those. And that was Gary's idea to do a show. So massive respect for him actually caring enough about people to, put his reputation on the line and risk doing an interview addressing specific attacks or objections to his work. So that's what David Paulman said. And he had a bunch of responses. And again, like I said, this hurts because I was a former co-host. David Russell was the one who alerted me to all these posts. But here's David Paulman. I helped set up the show. I brought my friend Dr. Gary Habermas on as a favor to my co-host David Russell and David Paulman right here back in the day, years ago, to do a show. So, and Gary, out of respect, came on and did a show with them on the historical Jesus, and it went great. Both Paulman and Russell loved having Habermas on the show. Okay, so Lydia McGrew basically responded. There was about 59 responses from Christians, and the good news is it was a bit of a mix. There were Christians that saddened me that kind of followed what Lydia and David Paulman were saying, but there was also Christians standing up for Gary and saying, "No, I'm not going to trust that wretch Paulogia. He's just some lying, godless atheist. Why would you believe his heavily edited and manipulative video clips taken out of context, as opposed to believing you're Christian?" Like, the right thing to do is to handle this privately first. Don't express, "Oh, Gary's a liar." I think as Christians, we owe it to each other to reach out privately, get all of the details first before we start making these conclusions and stuff. I think it was very wrong to watch a Paulogia video and then betray your friend Gary Habermas, or a scholar that you've known and respected, at the very least in Paulman's case. Anyways, before I get to the assessment, let's just read. So here's another Christian who I've known and I have respect for. I've been on several shows with them, debating Molinism versus Calvinism, by Colton Carlson, a famous apologist who backs up Calvinism. And here he is saying, "It reminds me of when Richard Dawkins claimed in The God Delusion that many scholars doubt whether Jesus actually existed, but then John Lennox pressed him on it, and he eventually conceded it was false." So Colton Carlson is comparing Gary Habermas to Richard Dawkins. That's not good. Not a good thing at all. And then here we have the famous Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, who I know him the least, but out of everyone, I've only been on one show with him. But again, he's another person that I have a lot of respect for. I loved his Apologetics Academy when he hosted that back in the day. I don't know if he's still doing it, but he says Gary is arguably the Christian equivalent of Bart Ehrman. So again, this insult from a fellow Christian. And then Lydia responds, "I'd have to say that would be Mike Licona." So no, that's not Gary. Mike Licona is like a godless atheist, like Bart Ehrman and stuff. So, but it depends on the specific properties of Bart Ehrman one has in mind. Blah blah blah, kind of thing. At this point, both Mike and Gary have done dishonest things. So you can see the reason I read this, again, these are fellow brothers and sisters, so I'm not trying to get you guys to attack these people. That's not my goal. I was, again, when I first saw this, when David Russell first brought this to my attention, I admit I was angry, and it did feel like they were betraying Gary Habermas and that sort of thing. But as I reflect on it, I want to be as charitable as I can, and looking at it from their perspective, I honestly think they're sincere here, and they're just trying to call out the truth as they see it, right? They really do think that Gary has been caught lying by Paulogia, and that as Christians they have a duty to call that out and that sort of thing. So my hopes for this show is I want to go over the substantive reasons why these Christians think this about Gary. And again, on that front, Lydia McGrew is the only one who's actually given substantive reasons. So I'm going to be addressing those and assuming that will work for the rest of the Christians, and the hopes of, let's reconcile, let's get this straight and resolve it. Because I guarantee you, I promise you, David Paulman and Lydia McGrew at the very least, even Colton Carlson to some extent, me as well. We've been on several shows together, but for whatever it's worth coming from me, I guarantee you Gary was not deliberately lying, and he's not suffering from like some sort of massive mental decline where he's totally deluded and has no clue what he's saying. And I hope to prove that. Okay, so let's get into our assessment. Gary Habermas, liar, lunatic, or leader? Basically, the evidence from Paulogia's video seems to leave us with a bit of a trilemma. There are three possible explanations to explain the various issues raised by Paulogia and subsequently by our fellow Christian brothers and sisters. Either Gary is a deliberate fraud, and this seems to be the prevalent view among atheists and skeptics, but most saddeningly, among these four Christian brothers and sisters, David Paulman, Colton Carlson, Jonathan McClatchy, and Lydia McGrew, they think this is the option they go for, that Gary is a liar, deliberate, purposeful, willful liar. The second is that he's getting older and is now suffering from some sort of dementia or mental decline. He's making mental goofs all the time, and I call that the lunatic option. Or number three, he is an honest and brilliant resurrection scholar. He's a leader who we personally, and for each of the Christians here, they have benefited from for decades, for years, if not decades, off of his resurrection research. And he deserves to be respected regardless of whether there are some minor errors or not. Now, my goal is going to be to show that Gary Habermas and the scholarship contained within his Magnum Opus Resurrection series does not demonstrate any sort of deception nor dementia on Gary's part. Instead, it is solely a reflection of the true status that he has as a Christian scholar and leader who helped redefine resurrection scholarship with his minimal facts approach. That's going to be the goal for this episode. I just want the Christians to remember, as philosophers and logicians, we are Christians filled with the Holy Spirit. We're rational. We apply the principle of charity. We don't engage or endorse satanic schemes of the skeptics. We don't support that sort of thing of trying to destroy an innocent man or make him seem stupid or hurt your fellow brother in Christ, Gary Habermas and or myself. You are there to support us. You're on our team. And atheists and skeptics constantly complain, I heard Paulogia and the Rabyd Atheist conspiring together. We need to back each other up. We need to engage in skeptical atheistic tribalism to combat the Christians because the Christians always band together. And that's just not true. That I can prove is BS from 8 years of podcasting is total nonsense. It's the opposite. Atheists are very tribalistic. They band together no matter what. They'll excuse any error from an atheist. They give their money to their cult leader, atheistic leaders, no matter what. They back them up. They never fail to defend, whether it means they have to lie, swear, insult. They'll do whatever it takes to support their kind. Christians don't do that. And to some extent, I like that because our commitment is first to God and truth. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of, we are brothers and sisters. We have to stand together and defend one another when it's appropriate to do so. And in order to do that, we need to apply the principle of charity to each other. And I've been rather perplexed and concerned as of late to see why so many people, including fellow Christians, seem to be falling into the satanic schemes of the skeptics. And I think it's because they're not employing the principle of charity. I think that is what it ultimately comes down to.
I want to remind you about the two parts of the principle of charity. Okay? In the last lecture, I explained that the principle of charity, as Feldman explains it, is really about trying to make the argument as strong as possible. And strong here is one of our technical terms. So this is an inductive argument. So a quick reminder, for an inductive argument to be strong, it's got to be cogent, premises must be reasonable to believe, and it has to be undefeated. Okay, well, we've started that process. We've tried to make the argument cogent. Indeed, we've got two reconstructions, both of which make the argument cogent. But then there's that other part of the principle of charity, which says, look, be faithful to what you reasonably think is the author or speaker's intention. What did the person mean to say?
Okay, so you get the point there, right? We try to steelman the other person insofar as we can be and are consistent with the intention of what they're intending to say, not necessarily what they literally do say or not. We want to get at what is the proposition they intend to say. And sometimes that means going beyond their words, such as if you have the opportunity, asking before you make a fool of yourself, claim somebody's a liar, maybe you should go to them privately and say, what did you mean when you said this? Or I'm having problems with this. Can you just explain to me, this looks like a lie. Can you give me your take or something like that? And this is philosophy 101, folks. Paulogia and the Rabyd Atheists get an F- because they purposefully distort Gary's arguments and the truth through selective editing. But I have to say, Lydia McGrew and the other Christians, they're not doing so well either. Because they're not being charitable to Gary. They had other avenues I think they should have used first before coming to their conclusions that Gary is dishonest and that sort of thing. And I just want to give you an example of where the principle of charity should have been applied, but wasn't. And it led to these foolishness. So let's take a look at some examples. How about let's be uncharitable to Paulogia. Again, I'm not going to be doing originally I planned to do an expose video exposing all of the little hypocrisies and applying his own reasoning against the atheists, Paulogia and the Rabyd Atheist, to make them look foolish, to paint them in their own light, giving them an edifying dose of their own, to expose them and make them go, well, are Christians warranted in assuming the worst about you? Maybe you should rethink what you're doing to Gary. That said, now that my focus is on the Christians, I'm not going to be doing that. But I do want to just, in this case, to make my point about the principle of charity and its importance, let me just highlight about a few of many that I encountered of contradictions and incoherences and erroneous, fallacious reasoning and hypocrisies on the part of Paulogia and Rabyd Atheist. But let's just take a look at a few from Paulogia himself, just to see, hey, if we don't want to apply the principle of charity, if we don't apply it to Paulogia, we can make him look like quite an erroneous fool.
Advantage of you have sort of a policy where you want to engage in certain types of skeptics, credible scholarly types, whereas you try to avoid mentioning, popularizers or dealing with popularizers.
Right.
I just wanted to get from you, they will take advantage of that and say, well, see, Gary's afraid of me. He can't refute my argument.
Right.
I just want to hear from you. What is your thinking behind that policy?
Well, I'll say positive and negative. I've not seen anybody. You see more of these responses than I do, for sure. But I've not seen anybody say he's afraid of me.
I'm pretty sure I watch more of these responses than both of you. And I'll agree with Gary here that I've not seen anybody say that they are afraid of Gary. And Gary's real-life friend, under the name Real Seeker, was actively in the live chat for those.
They're not facts. He thinks they're facts, but they're not. I absolutely disagree with all of them, pretty much.
So if I had to guess, that's probably where the report originated. And 2 YouTubers evolved through legendary development to 3 skeptical scholars. Let's try to recreate this. You may not have realized this, Gary, but your author index actually has a list of citations for each scholar, which a person can count. I came up with a total count of 5,882 author references. This seems reasonable since Gary himself, in this very interview, estimates between 5,000 and 6,000 such references.
5,000 is probably fair, but if somebody knew an objective number, they could say, oh no, it's 5,759. Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know that. But I would take it up to 6,000.
So we're in the ballpark. And to Gary's earlier point, we can see that agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman is referenced 101 times, where Mennonite Philip Wiebe is referenced only twice. Out of the 5,882 references, 4,805 were from self-proclaimed Christians, or 81%. That's right, the numbers got slightly worse for Gary when considering the references. Bad news for Gary.
More like bad news for Paulogia. Not only does this buffoon goof up once here, he goofs up twice on this front. So number one, he totally takes Gary Habermas out of context. The 5,882 citations that he counts does not correspond to what Gary Habermas said in our original interview. We were talking about the number of scholarly sources he read over his lifetime. He and Ben Shaw read as part of their minimal facts approach proper. Nothing to do with volume 3, just what was their minimal facts approach. And Gary estimates about 6,000 between him, 5,000, and 1,000 for Ben Shaw, combined 6,000 scholarly peer-reviewed literatures and books that he has read in French, English, and German as part of his scholarly consensus criterion, not all of which is in volume 3. You lied about that, Paulogia. You didn't read Gary's intro, where Gary says, Volume 3 is not a reflection of my minimal facts approach proper. I couldn't fit all 1,500 pages. The publisher wouldn't let me. So this is a subset of all the 6,000 sources and data points. So Paulogia just totally screws up here. He's lying and misrepresenting Gary Habermas. Again, we're treating Paulogia uncharitably here. So he must be lying when he says that there's 5,882. Remember, Paulogia, if we go back to the clip, let's play a clip of Paulogia admitting there's over 8,000 references. Remember in round 1?
Fortunately, the book itself does give us the precise answer because it has a handy author index that someone like me can simply count.
That's one bat. Two bats. Three fabulous flyers.
How many unique authors does Gary's Volume 3 reference? 558. That's twice as many as the number I pulled out of thin air. But 558 is a lot closer to 250 than it is to 8,000. Gary wanted to make me look silly, so he picked this giant number. Never mind that it was for an unrelated statistic. One could theoretically write a book with 8,000 footnotes and have all of those reference only one scholar.
So there you see, in round 1, Paulogia admits there's over 8,000 footnotes, just like Dr. Gary Habermas and Ben Shaw admit. But now here in round 3, he's contradicting himself. He's lying to you. He's saying, there's only 5,882. So since we're being uncharitable, which is it, Paulogia? Why are you lying when you said there's 8,000? Now there's only 5,882. And worse yet, you're taking Gary Habermas out of context. Gary never said there was 5,882 footnotes or citations in his volume 3. That's not what he said. He said he's looked at 6,000 papers, not all of which are in volume 3 or referenced in volume. Sounds to me like you're being dishonest. What's really happening? Look, there was, as Ben Shaw says, there was over 8,000 footnotes in volume 3. So, but Paulogia counted, didn't he? He got 5,882. So isn't that a contradiction? Well, remember, Paulogia says it's easy to just count, right?
Because it has a handy author index that someone like me can simply count.
That's one bat. Two bats. Three fabulous flyers.
Paulogia can't count. He's made a second goof. Not only is he ripping Gary out of context, and contradicting himself between round 1 and round 3 as to how many citations are here. But the reason he gets it wrong is because he doesn't know how to count. For example, someone posted in the comments 26 to 32. Paulogia, I've counted, and he says there's 101 citations here. But the problem is, for things like this where it's underlined, these don't represent one citation. For example, this is 7 citations. There's way more than 101 citations of the skeptic Bart Ehrman. Paulogia screwed up his count. His numbers are complete rubbish. Sesame Street characters are better at counting than Paulogia. He doesn't know the difference between 1 citation and 7 citations here. And it looks like he's totally miscounted every single underlined source. He treated them all as 1 citation instead of 2 or 7 or 4 in this case, or 5, whatever it is. What happened here? Well, fortunately, there is actually some footage of Paulogia when he was going through his author index counting.
Oh, yep, book. Eat book. Yep. Oh, nope. Oh. Words. Yep. Uh-huh. Read book. Yep.
So if we wanted to give Paulogia a dose of his own, those are just 3 examples of where, if we're not endorsing the principle of charity, then we could easily argue Paulogia makes several goofs, therefore showing that all of his atheistic fans should abandon him and say he's a liar, he's a lunatic, he's demented, he's lost his brain and his mind, and stop supporting Paulogia and come back to the Christian faith, because Paulogia is wrong and your atheism is quite foolish. Am I correct in this? No, because, again, I'm not being charitable, and the rational agent should be charitable. And I argue that Christians need to be charitable to Gary Habermas. Otherwise, they're bound to make these goofs. So let's look at the interview-based objections, specifically based on my Real Seekers response video with Dr. Gary Habermas. Now, Lydia McGrew was the only Christian that really outlined her substantive objections as reasons why she's concluded that Gary is dishonest and or deluded on her end. The other Christians seem mainly to just concur with her analysis. So I'm going to focus specifically on Lydia McGrew because she is the only one that actually presented reasons for thinking that Paulogia is correct and that Gary Habermas is dishonest. The others just seem to watch Paulogia and have bought into his propaganda there. They don't, at least in the posts that they make, they don't present good reasons. So I want to interact with Lydia McGrew as the leader of this group of Christians. She outlines a total of about 3 to 4 interview-based objections. So the first is based on the 90% or more threshold and Gary's distinction for being a minimal fact, and Gary's distinction between that being a prescriptive or descriptive threshold. Now, Lydia claims that Gary has used his 90-something% criterion as a prescriptive requirement for being a minimal fact for years in multiple sources, not just one. So this is 2 objections in one. She said, and we'll come to that in a moment, and only now backtracks about his using that in a descriptive sense only. Number 2, the Volume 3 scholars versus scholarly citations distinction. First, Gary said that Volume 3 has more non-Christian than Christians as scholars or individuals in the author index for the book as a whole. Then he changed to saying it has more non-evangelical versus evangelical citations within each topic section. And thirdly and finally, there's no precise head count or rigorous head count. Lydia claims that Gary has argued that he did a rigorous head count tally or count of the scholars and their positions for years. And now he's admitting that he did no such head count outside of the empty tomb, relying instead on his own quote-unquote opinion off the top of his head. So let's get into each of these objections, starting with number 1. So the first one, the 90% threshold, was it prescriptive or descriptive? Let's see what Lydia's objection is in her own words. She has 2 here. Gary gave his answer in my interview with him as, look, this 90-something% standard was never intended to be a precise or rigorous, to use Lydia's language, minimal facts requirement. Now, interestingly, the atheist YouTuber Paulogia doesn't necessarily disagree with Gary on this point. In fact, he seems to concede or grant that Gary is correct, and even goes so far as to say that all that matters to him and the atheists is that they want to see this precise or rigorous head count statistically with their own eyeballs. Whatever it comes out to reach, they don't care.
Here's a very pretty interview from 2019.
I do a minimal facts argument, and I use basically 6 minimal facts. Well, the 2 criteria I use is that I won't use a fact that's not multiply evidenced from a bunch of different sources. And secondly, because of that, the vast majority of scholars in the 90-something percentile allow its historicity.
So 2 criteria for a minimal fact: multiply evidenced, and vast majority of scholars agree, 90-something%. Or is it?
Another main thing that came up that I've seen some skeptics going on about is this criterion. And you do indeed mention this yourself in volume 1 of your book, where it's there, where you have this 90-something percentile threshold, right, for you to, as the scholarly consensus criterion of being a minimal fact.
From volume 1 of your book.
An oft-asked question relates to my repeated references that the vast majority of scholars, or virtually all of these experts, agree with this or that conclusion. Can these phrases be identified in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have already been more specific, at least when referencing the shorter list of minimal historical facts. I most frequently think in terms of a 90-something percentile head count.
So
Right.
I just wanted to kind of throw it open to you. Is this something you've, apparently contradicted yourself on? What did you mean by the 90-something percentile? And how did you go about determining whether a fact met this threshold or not?
I only know of one place I've done that. Now, there might be another one or two that you mentioned, but I only know off the top of my head, I only know one case.
From Gary's 2012 peer-reviewed paper called The Minimal Facts Approach to the Resurrection of Jesus, the role of methodology is a crucial component in establishing historicity.
Regarding my references to the vast majority or virtually all scholars who agree, is it possible to identify these phrases in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have identified these expressions more specifically. At least when referencing the most important historical occurrences, I frequently think in terms of a 90-something percentile head count. No doubt this is one of the reasons why the concept has gained some attention. And there's a difference between prescriptive and descriptive. And I'm frequently asked in interviews, I'm not asking you, did you set up a criterion? I'm asking you, where do you think the scholars that you've cited line up? And I'll say, oh, they could well be over 90. But that's descriptive. I don't say anywhere in print that I know of, I don't say I only take the 90% who concede this fact or that fact. Like the keyword only or something like that. No, I'll say things like, I don't count those where they're at when I say a high majority, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were over 90. That's descriptive. Prescriptive would be, you got to be this high to be in the study. And that I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever said that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I have heard myself a couple interviews where you do mention this 90, but you never give it in a prescriptive sense, like, unless 90% or more scholars believe it, I won't accept it. You've never said it in those prescriptive terms.
Yeah.
Once again, both Gary and Dale are completely oblivious to what the minimal fact skeptics care about. Gary has two criteria for a minimal fact.
The first one is, I will use no fact, no historical fact that is not attested by many different evidences. The second point is that because these facts are so well accredited, virtually every scholar there is will admit them.
Gary has spent his career, and indeed the first volume of his 4-volume Magnum Opus book series, on the first criteria. The first volume is even called Evidences. The problem is, Gary has been at this for decades and has never provided the data on the second point, on demonstrating that virtually every scholar will admit them. Whether Gary chooses to define virtually every scholar in terms of a percentage or any other metric is up to Gary. Whether Gary chooses to have a uniform metric for each fact or be flexible on a fact-by-fact basis is also up to Gary. No one is attempting to impose rules on Gary. All that anyone wants is for Gary to show his work. It makes no difference whatsoever whether the percentage of consensus, whatever number that is a prescriptive number, i.e., that Gary excludes or includes facts based on that math, or merely a post hoc descriptive number, i.e., Gary is describing his observation after the fact. Doesn't matter at all if it's prescriptive or descriptive. No one cares. The point is that you've claimed to be doing the scholarly work where you have two criteria, and one of the criteria is consensus, and for decades, you've been asking everyone to just take you at your word. Trust me, bro, is not how scholarship is done. And Gary puts himself forth as doing scholarly work. Gary felt confident enough to put in writing in his book that his descriptive number is 90%. So it is entirely reasonable for everyone to ask to see the math. That it's not prescriptive doesn't absolve you from showing the math, because you've made it clear that some level of confidence is prescriptive to become a fact. No one's going to force you to retract your life work if the math ends up being 85 or 80 or whatever it is. Just show us the math you've said you were doing.
There you go. Paulogia himself is saying this is a nonsensical objection. This means nothing. It's irrelevant. Gary is quite correct that he's never said this was a prescriptive standard unless you get 90% or more. Only if you get 90% or more will you be included as a fact. Gary has never said that in any of the sources I'm aware of, in print or in interviews, or that he's aware of. He's only ever used that descriptively to say, based on my studies, it looks like at least 90% or more, something around that ballpark. Within that range, they accept the minimal facts. That's all he's ever said. And Paulogia is quite happy to go, cool, yeah, that's fine. I don't care whether it's 85% or 82%, whatever it is. I just want to see the precise, rigorous head count of how you arrived at these numbers. So Paulogia is dismissing, and the atheists are dismissing this as a problem. They say no one cares. Well, unbeknownst to Paulogia, someone cares. Dr. Lydia McGrew, a critic of the minimal facts approach and fellow Christian, apparently does care about this. And starting on, let's take a look on the right here, what she says. She has two objections. Gary says that he thinks he only gave the 90-something% definition of vast majority in one place, though there may be more. There are, in fact, multiple places where he gives that minimum, and one of them is right in Volume 1 of his Magnum Opus, which was only recently published. Third, and to my mind one of the worst, he tries to make a bogus distinction between a prescriptive and a descriptive use of a vast majority threshold, and that he's merely said things like, I wouldn't be surprised if it were over 90%. This is absolutely false. Habermas has said again and again that it is a requirement for something to be a minimal fact that it must be affirmed by a vast majority of scholars. In fact, He's even prided himself on not counting the empty tomb as a minimal fact because it's affirmed, he thinks, by a mere 75%. So whatever the vast majority requirement is, it was always presumably notably more than 75%. To be sure, he could have chosen to use some number short of 90% as the definition of vast majority if he wished to do so. And he may have chosen 90% after getting that impression from his informal literature survey. But he has never treated being affirmed by a vast majority of scholars as an optional part of his method, as something he's merely noting as an interesting observation, or anything like that. Being affirmed by a vast majority has always been one of the two necessary criteria. And yes, he uses the word criteria right in Volume 1 for being counted as a minimal fact. In the only sense that counts, that is prescriptive. For him to claim otherwise is a shocking sophistry. I'm terribly sorry to have to say this, but I don't even see how some sort of mental failure can be the best explanation of what's gone on with these matters in this past year. If Dr. Habermas has the mental wherewithal to give these interviews and to come up with these goalpost shifts and gaslighting about his own claims, even in his own most recent publications and in other recent interviews, how can he not be held responsible for them? And she goes further in a video she did discussing this issue about the 90-some% threshold.
Habermas definitely has defined vast majority of scholars, or virtually all, or those kinds of terms, as 90-something%. And to be a minimal fact, one of the criteria is that it's supposed to be supported by 90-something%. Now, in recent years, he's really tried to emphasize that's not the most important criterion. That's not what makes it a fact. Yeah, we get that, but it is a criterion. He's not going to call something a minimal fact unless it's supported by 90-something%. And even for like the next level down of, I forget what he sometimes calls it, second order facts or something like that, supporting additional facts of like a few more, they're also supposed to at least have a majority and a strong majority of scholarly agreement. The empty tomb is one of those. So again, these are being defined in percentile terms. So just to demonstrate, he definitely has defined vast majority as 90-something%. Now, I'm going to give a quote here. This is from Volume 1 of his Magnum Opus, which had just come out when, in the same year when he did this very surprising live stream. So this isn't even from long ago. Here we go. An oft-asked question relates to my repeated references that the vast majority of scholars, or virtually all of these experts, agree with this or that conclusion. Can these phrases be identified in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have already been more specific. At least when referencing the shorter list of minimal historical facts, I most frequently think in terms of a 90-something% head count. Of course, this only applies to those scholars who publish their views and accept the historical fact or a close approximation of it. This is from page 94, volume 1, on the resurrection in the Kindle edition. All right. Similarly, I'm going to be quoting several times here from a review of Dr. Lacona's resurrection book, which Dr. Habermas wrote, kind of a detailed review in 2012. And you can find this online. Regarding my references, this is Habermas speaking, to the vast majority of virtually all scholars who agree, is it possible to identify these phrases in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have identified these expressions more specifically. At least when referencing the most important historical occurrences, I frequently think in terms of a 90-something% head count. Okay, no doubt this is one of the reasons why the concept has gained some attention. Exactly the same phrase, 90-something% head count. All right. What else do we know? Well, we know that Habermas says in this live stream about 11 months ago that he never defined a percentile, except for the empty 2, which is not a minimal fact. All right, so here's where he denies that. All right, Lacona asks, what qualifies as a vast majority? Habermas, good question. We've never put, and then he pauses. A lot of people say things. We get emails saying, oh, you guys say it's got to be over 90%. I don't think I've ever said that. I don't know if you've ever said that, speaking to Lacona. We don't put amounts on it, Habermas says. And then later, Habermas, I never defined it. And I did it on purpose because let's just put it this way. If I defined it, you know, what's going to happen if I said 85? Someone's going to say, I found 3 of your people and they were 84. I mean, I just think that that discussion goes nowhere. So what he's saying here is that he believes he never defined a percentile, because if he defined a percentile and someone went out and found that some of the scholars maybe had changed their mind or that he, you know, misinterpreted them or whatever, then it would be below that minimum percentile. And he just thinks that goes nowhere. So he says he never defined it in order to make it less falsifiable.
It's got to be well evidenced, and it's got to be granted by a vast majority of scholars.
That's the second, and I'm not just saying.
And
this
what qualifies as a vast majority?
Good question. We've never put, a lot of people say things, we get emails saying, oh, you guys say it's got to be over 90%. I don't think I've ever said that. I don't know if you've ever said that. We don't put amounts on it, but I would say something that qualifies as vast majority of critical scholars. And the first criterion is enough evidence to call it a fact. A second one to say most scholars agree with these. And when
most scholars is 50.1%.
I'd say it's much, much, much higher than that.
I mean, one time you told me vast majority would be like around 85%.
I would say.
Are you backing down from that?
I think, no. I think over 80 is fair, over 85 is fair, over 90 is fair. And you're going to get different percentages depending on different facts you're talking about. If you're talking about Jesus' crucifixion, that's going to be very, very high.
Sure, but if you're saying vast majority and you're using this as a criterion, did you have any percentage in mind?
Never had a percentage, and I never did a head count. I did a head count on the empty tomb. It's not one of the 6 facts. So
what would you say about?
I do not have a preset percentage. Oh no, we missed by 5%. No,
So
I've never
an
ever
answer
done
to okay. So you got George Manat here, Jr. Definition of majority. I really wish that you had a better definition for this, to be honest with you.
That's wonderful, but I never defined it, and I did it on purpose because let's just put it this way. If I defined it, you know what's going to happen? If I said 85, someone's going to say, I found 3 of your people and they were 84. I mean, I just think that discussion goes nowhere. But I will tell you, whether I made a mistake or I didn't make a mistake, we don't put percentages on it, and I have not done that. We got called down in that dialogue with Bowman and Stewart, and they thought, Bob's a great friend, but he thought I said 90. I've not said anything in print. People might get that idea, but I don't say it.
When we did the case for the resurrection of Jesus, we said James was about 90%, I think. The other appearances, like to the apostles, was close to 100%. Paul, close to 100%.
And I think
we said empty tomb was around 75.
Now that I counted. Remember, I counted empty tomb and I updated it in the first volume. I'll go on empty tomb, but it's not on minimal facts. I think you wrote those other percentages in the co-author book.
I will say this. I haven't studied it like Gary has. Okay, but I've looked at enough sources.
He's very good.
And I tell you, a significant majority, a very strong majority. Yes. I haven't done the bean counting, but a very strong majority would agree on these minimal facts.
They would.
Okay, so that is the objections from Lydia McGrew. She's basically got 2 problems here. So number 1, the most important, Gary denied giving the 90-something% standard anywhere in writing and or providing even orally a definition of vast majority of scholars as being 90-something% in general. And secondly, that this was basically this highlight between prescriptive and descriptive 90% is just totally bogus according to Lydia McGrew, and it's not true. This is a lie to cover up his his screw up that he's always been claiming 90 something percent as this prescriptive standard. And now that he has nothing to show for it, apparently, according to him, he's backtracking and saying, no, I meant it was only descriptive. Secondly, Gary is also wrong by saying he only gave this in one source that he can think of. But he's open and saying maybe it's in other places, and Lydia's taking him to task for this. So what is our evaluation here? So number one, in the first place, starting with the most substantive issue, right? The prescriptive-descriptive difference. Lydia McGrew is, all respect to her, and it's understandable. I understand why she got the interpretation she did of what Gary and I are saying. Again, but using the principle of charity, Lydia McGrew is simply wrong here. She screwed up. She misinterpreted what Gary's answer to this objection was, and what Gary's distinction between the prescriptive and descriptive in terms of the 90% definition for the vast majority of scholars was. And I went over every source, interview, written and interviews and written by parties, referenced by the parties in this dispute. And Gary has been completely consistent throughout this. Gary was never, as Lydia falsely claims, denying that his vast majority of critical scholars' threshold was a prescriptive criterion for qualifying as a minimal fact. Lydia McGrew is absolutely correct that Gary has always said that, and he's never denied that there is this prescriptive standard you have to qualify as a minimal fact. You have to qualify under the criterion of being accepted by the vast majority of scholars. And Gary descriptively defines that as it's around 90% something percent. So Lydia McGrew does a great job proving that Gary has always considered the vast majority of scholars as a criterion, a prescriptive criterion to qualify as a minimal fact. And she gives the great example, the one that Dr. Gary Habermas gives, the empty tomb. The empty tomb, since 1975, has been seen at 75%. Later on, it went down to 66%. Now it's up to 80%, right? But when it was 75%, that was clearly not good enough to qualify as the vast majority of scholars. And that's why Gary didn't include it as a minimal fact. So there is a prescriptive element here, and Gary's never denied that. Instead, Gary has been perfectly clear that he was simply denying that a precise percentage of scholars, 90% or more, unless or only if you get 90% or more of scholars accepting a fact, only then does it qualify as a minimal fact. He's saying, no, I never used the 90-something% definition of vast majority of scholars as in a prescriptive sense. It was only ever descriptively that I used that percentage as a definition for vast majority based on his literature survey. And he goes, yeah, I would, Gary, Lydia, he messes up here, but Lydia quotes Gary as saying, I would be surprised if it was 90 something. Well, obviously Gary in context would say, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm expecting it. I think the minimal facts are more than 90%. 90% or more of scholars accept his 6 minimal facts. So he wouldn't be surprised is what he was saying on that front. Descriptively, given his literature survey, he believes 90+% of scholars all accept his 6 minimal facts. Whereas for something like the empty tomb, it's only 75%. And on a prescriptive level, 90% plus qualifies under vast majority of scholars, 75% doesn't. That's all we know. So in other words, Gary was saying that descriptively speaking, he'd argue that at least 90% or more of qualified scholars accept the 6 minimal facts as true, and further, prescriptively speaking, this is sufficient or high enough of a percentage of scholars to qualify under his minimal facts approach, whereas 75% scholarly acceptance for things like the empty tomb is not high enough. And I have insider knowledge. I was Gary's co-host for the show, and based on my private discussions with Gary, we went over the interview questions and discuss them first before we hit the record button. So I know for a fact, and Lydia, you're my friend, I ask you, do you think I'm lying here when I say this, that this is what Gary was intending to say? And I think this is what he actually said. If you look at everything in context, even the Mike Lacona interview, he's clear. He's saying it wasn't only 90% and stuff like this. You can understand what he is intending to say on this front. And I think he is communicating it properly. But even in my private discussions before I did that response interview of the, refuting the skeptics and stuff, prior to doing our show, I affirmed that Gary was right in the interview that we did together. And I affirm this in the interview. I say, you're correct, Gary, because we have this understanding of what we're saying. Gary is never denying that there was any prescriptive element to the vast majority of scholars' criterion. You're quite correct there. But you were uncharitable or misinterpreted Gary as denying that. He wasn't. He was denying specifically that the 90% or more, unless you have 90% or more, that's the definition of the vast majority of scholars. And that's the prescriptive element. No, the 90-something% was only ever descriptive, while the vast majority of scholars, which is somewhere around 90%, but if a fact got, for example, if a fact got 89.99% scholarly acceptance or 85% acceptance, Gary's not going to, okay, well then we don't take you. As a matter of fact, Gary has never specified. He has this vague, unspecified on purpose range. We don't know what that is. Would 85% qualify? Would 80% qualify? Would 87, something like that. We know that 75% doesn't qualify. So it's got to be over 75%. But as to what the range is, we don't know. The only thing we can tell is it's around and or at the very least includes 90% or more of scholarly acceptance. That's all we know. Other than that, Gary has purposefully left it unspecified, the definition of vast majority of scholars. And in fact, Gary has always been consistent on this front, even in the Mike Lacona interview from last year, where he confirms this range notion. And even Lydia picks up on this, right? Where he talks about not denying something that has 85% or even 80%, Gary says, could qualify under the vast majority of scholars, possibly, right? This is Gary talking off the cuff. Let's take a look at that.
Good question. We've never put, a lot of people say things, we get emails saying, oh, you guys say it's got to be over 90%. I don't think I've ever said that. I don't know if you've ever said that. We don't put amounts on it, but I would say something that qualifies as vast majority of critical scholars. And the first criterion is enough evidence to call it a fact. A second one to say most scholars agree with these. And when
most scholars is 50.1%.
I'd say it's much, much, much higher than that.
I mean, one time you told me vast majority would be like around 85%.
I would say.
Are you backing down from that?
I think no. I think over 80 is fair, over 85 is fair, over 90 is fair, and you're going to get different percentages depending on different facts you're talking about.
We don't put amounts on it, Habermas says. And then later, Habermas, I never defined it, and I did it on purpose because let's just put it this way. If I defined it, what's going to happen if I said 85? Someone's going to say, I found 3 of your people and they were 84. I mean, I just think that discussion goes nowhere. So what he's saying here is that he believes he never defined a percentile, because if he defined a percentile and someone went out and found that some of the scholars maybe had changed their mind or that he, misinterpreted them or whatever, then it would be below that minimum percentile. And he just thinks that goes nowhere. So he says he never defined it in order to make it less falsifiable.
So as you can see, Gary's quite clear all the way back to that first interview, and Lydia McGrew is well aware of this. She quotes from it herself, where Gary says 80%, 85% could qualify, 90% could qualify. And that's consistent. Yes, 75% is lower than 80 and 85 and 90%. So, okay, Gary off the cuff is showing us that the definition of vast majority of scholars, that prescriptive criterion, can be defined or is consistent with 90% or more of scholars accepting it, 85% or more scholars accepting it, even 80% or more of scholars accepting it. That's what Gary said. And that's perfectly consistent with everything he's been saying about the empty tomb at 75% not qualifying as a minimal fact in everything over the years. And that just proves that Gary has this general unspecified range in mind, just as he's always said, as to what qualifies in his mind as the vast majority of scholars. And it's not this hard, rigorous, precise limit or cutoff percentile mark, right? 90% or more. So if a minimal fact has 89.9999999% scholarly acceptance, Gary dismisses it. It doesn't qualify as minimal facts. That's not what Gary has ever said. He's never had that hard cutoff point or limit. Instead, he has this flexible range, which has to be above a certain point. I would say it has to be above 80% of scholars. It has to be more than 80%, greater than 80%. And that's all we know on the prescriptive end. On the descriptive end, we know that the 6 minimal facts of Gary's told us 90-something%, 90% or more of scholars, according to his literature review, accept the 6 minimal facts as being true. Well, 90% plus is greater than 81% or more. So, yeah, that makes sense why they're included as minimal facts. Gary has been perfectly consistent on this front. Now, on the second issue pertaining to the 90% threshold, Lydia claims Gary lied about the definition being only found in one source. Now, once again, Lydia is wrong on this. It makes sense given her misinterpretation of what Gary was denying here. But look, Gary was simply stating that to his mind, he has never said that he has used the 90% or more threshold in a prescriptively rigorous or precise way in his writings. And further, he's saying he can only think of one occasion orally. Perhaps this is the example he gave to Mike Licona about Bob Stewart, as an example where he did mistakenly use it or communicate it in a precise, prescriptive way. So Gary's being honest here, honest to a fault, and admitting, maybe there was one time orally where I talked about the 90%, not in a descriptive way, but in a prescriptive way, as though it's a criterion. Only if you have 90% or more scholarly consensus, then you qualify as a minimal fact. And I guess my guess here is that maybe Gary miscommunicated that by accident one time to Bob Stewart, and that's why he's remembering that anecdotal example with Mike Licona in his interview. But other than that, no, he's always been clear that 90%, only 90% or more, unless you have 90% or more, is not the definition of the vast majority of scholars. Gary has always left that vague and unspecified within certain limits. 75% not good enough. We learned most recently 80% not good enough. And we know 90% or more good enough. So between 81 to 89%, what would be good enough or not? Gary just has not told us. He's not specified, except for telling Mike Licona that 85%, when he spoke off the cuff, 85%, he would probably include that. So that's all we know. So Gary has been absolutely vindicated on this front. He never denied that he has spoken of a 90% generalized definition for the vast majority of scholars in his interviews or writings. That's not what Gary was denying. He was denying specifically that only 90% or more meets the cutoff requirement for qualifying under the vast majority of scholars criterion. So we, by conclusion, we started off here with the Gary Habermas trilemma. Is based on this evidential consideration, is Gary a liar, a lunatic, or a leader? Well, it appears that Gary Habermas was entirely correct here, to the point that even the atheist Paulogia had to admit defeat and concede defeat to Gary Habermas on this front and turn the attention to an entirely different issue and say that we weren't understanding. No, we were responding to a skeptical objection here that was raised. Whether Paulogia cares about that or not, great. I'm glad Paulogia agrees with me and Gary, says this is not an issue. And he tries to point over, well, what about the lack of precision head counting? Cool, that's a third objection. Lydia shares that objection, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in terms of the 90% threshold, Paulogia is saying, yep, Gary is perfect. He's not lying. He's not a lunatic. He is a leader. He's been entirely consistent this whole time. Thanks, Paulogia. So it seems to me Lydia's accusations of dishonesty on Gary's part is entirely mistaken. It's provably and evidentially mistaken and false here. And further, I would find some fault with Lydia. Again, we're friends. I respect her like heck, her and her scholarship, and her attention to detail, and her concern for truth and having good Christian leaders. She actually cares about not just destroying Gary. I've been communicating with her privately, and I don't reveal private emails, but I'm attesting to her integrity as well. She actually cares and says, look, I believe Gary is not being a good leader, and I want him to improve or to repent. In any case, if he has been dishonest, have him repent and do better. That's a worthy goal given what she believes is true, and she's trying to act like a Christian there, right? So nonetheless, I do find fault with you, Lydia. I blame you on this specific issue, because I think you ought to have known better given the evidence available. Even in the Mike Lacona interview from years ago, you should have been more charitable and listening for, okay, what exactly is Gary meaning here? What is he intending to say? Put all the pieces together like I have, and you would have seen that, yeah, Gary is and always has been consistent on this front. So I find that you were a little bit careless on your end and uncharitable in assuming, oh, Gary was dishonest on this front, and based on your misinterpretation of what he was denying here. Nope, Gary has been completely vindicated. He's neither a liar nor a lunatic. He was entirely correct the whole time, and therefore he remains a great Christian leader and leading authority in resurrection scholarship on the basis of this objection. Okay, that's one down, or one or two. Remember, there were two objections included here. So that's 2 out of the 4 objections. What about the other 2, though? All right, so the second objection, Gary's Volume 3 reference to scholars versus scholarly citations. So Gary's contention here, he never intended to claim there were more non-Christian authors versus Christian authors in the author index of Volume 3. Basically, beloved Paulogia, you can see over here with his little graphic here, disagrees. He calculates 79% of the authors, according to his author index count, were Christians. So more non-Christian authors than Christian authors? Not true, says Paulogia. He begs to differ. And in fact, he lays out a total of the 3 rounds where he claims that Gary modified his claims 3 times in response to Paulogia's criticisms.
1, Gary bragged and was marketing his book as a resource that contains more non-Christians than Christians.
And there are probably more skeptics, yes, agnostics, Christian writers, let's say Jewish New Testament scholars. There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book.
So we're talking individual scholars, more non-Christian scholars than Christian scholars. And later again,
I counted, by the way, I think there's close to 600 different authors in that book. These guys could be, and I counted them by name, and there's more atheists, agnostics, and other kinds of skeptics, or people who could be pretty conservative, but in a different religion. So they could be a conservative Jewish scholar who's not a Christian. So there could be a lot of, again, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and non-Christian.
So he doubled down. Authors who are not a Christian versus authors who are a Christian. Gary says in this clip he counted them by name. So counting names was his methodology, which is the same methodology you heard me use in the clip earlier. In round 2, Gary didn't disagree with this methodology, or even my results. But
from what I recall from my own count, about 1/3 of all the people in the book are evangelicals. About 2/3 are not evangelicals. So what I meant was, I have way more people who would not call themselves evangelicals.
You can see my last video for all the problems with the evangelical backtrack, but it obviously didn't carry the day in Gary's circles, because in round 3, Gary decided that the whole methodology of counting human voices isn't what he meant after all, despite claiming doing his own name count during round 2.
Yeah, some skeptics have mentioned they just go by, a kind of a lazy, quick scan of the author index, and they say, oh, well, there's 443 Christians out of 558 authors in the index.
Easy, you call that easy?
I think we have different numbers here. I think by 558, you're probably talking individual scholars.
Right.
But what if one of these scholars has 10 sources, another one has 15? You started with how many actual scholars? Dale, I don't know the answer to that. I've never checked. I don't know how many scholars. Maybe it's, and you could say, well, there's, what'd you say, 5 what? I've not counted.
558 is what some people have counted.
I couldn't have told you that, but that's individual people. I don't know how many.
Fair enough.
How many separate authors? I'm only talking about how many publications, not by just counting heads. That's kind of, to me, superficial, because that doesn't, if Crossan, I'm just making something up. If Crossan is cited 52 times, and my favorite evangelical is cited 15 times, I think that gives the upper hand to the non-evangelical. Oh, no. What are they going to do? Say, no, that's 1 point for each. That's just a silly comment.
Yeah.
First guy gets 52 comments and the second one gets 15.
So that's what beloved Paulogia said. And Gary did indeed provide clarification as to what he meant when he said that there were more non-Christians than Christians in the interview he did with me. And thus he admits he misspoke. So he provides clarification in the subsequent interview he did with me, and as well on Mike Lacona's channel. And in terms of, okay, sometimes human beings misspeak and they need to clarify. Well, this is something that the atheist YouTuber Paulogia knows perfectly well, since he made his own little flub himself.
In round 1, Gary was bragging about volume 3 referencing more Christians than non-Christians, and I fact-checked him.
Now, I recognize that may have been a little bit too subtle for most of the fundy-lay atheists and skeptics out there.
Some so subtle you might not have even noticed, but your brain did.
Paulogia just said that Gary claimed there were more Christians than non-Christians.
More Christians than non-Christians.
Getting back on a more serious note here, look, fellow Christians like Dr. Lydia McGrew, they've actually been confused by Paulogia's propaganda here. So what is Lydia McGrew, what is her criticism? So she doesn't address this in her videos that I saw, but she does have a couple of Facebook posts that I'll read. So she says, quote unquote, Paulogia discusses something that I hadn't previously been following. Habermas's blatant goalpost shifting just within the past 6 months on how many Christian versus non-Christian scholars are cited in volume 3 of his Magnum Opus. The question itself is a little odd, and I don't even entirely understand why Habermas made such a big deal about it. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I've now been checking, and Paulogia is right. Habermas has engaged in the most jaw-dropping goalpost shifting in interviews just in the last 6 months. He really did first very explicitly claim that he counted and that there were more non-Christian than Christian scholars as individuals whose views are represented in volume 3. Then he shifted to more non-evangelicals than evangelicals as individual authors. And then in a third position, he shifted very radically to more citations of non-evangelicals than of evangelicals, and even called it superficial to count the number of individuals. This is nuts. This looks terribly dishonest. Then Lydia goes on responding to David Pullman. This is appalling stuff. I hadn't followed all the different strands of this. but the constant dodging concerning citing more non-Christians than Christians, switching to more non-evangelicals, then switching to no, it's not more Christian people, that's superficial, it's more references or citations to non-Christians, all things he's said recently. I'll be honest, at this point, I find it difficult to believe that those dodges can be attributed to some kind of mental loss of mental acuity. It looks more like utterly self-serving dishonesty. Claims, and this is the objection from a fellow Christian, Dr. Lydia McGrew, who seems to be supporting Paulogia's propaganda that there was this threefold modification in Gary's claims in response to, hey, first, I'll claim there's more non-Christians than Christians in the authors in here, in the author index. Oops, Paulogia fact-checked me and it's not the case. More evangelical authors versus more non-evangelical authors versus evangelical authors. Oops, Paulogia fact-checked that. More citations is what I meant. That's what Lydia McGrew is buying into Paulogia's framework here. And I would say call it propaganda, at least based on what she says in her objections. So let's get into an assessment. Scholars versus scholarly citations. Well, in the first place, our only concern in this show is to defend Gary's reputation for the benefit of our fellow Christians, such as Lydia McGrew. So we can immediately dismiss Paulogia's erroneous and deceitful claim that Gary shifted the goalposts 3 times in response to his criticisms. Why? I thought Lydia was parroting Paulogia's propaganda of this threefold goalpost shifting, wasn't she? Well, at first she was, yes, but at some point, I think even she herself had to admit Paulogia is full of BS. He's lying. At most, Gary Habermas changed once. That was it. There was, he had 2 positions, non-Christians to Christians, and then he changed to this scholarly citations argument. And this shows up in one of Lydia's posts. She says, quote unquote, "My only quibble so far with Paulogia's interpretations is that it looks to me like the shift from evangelical and non-evangelical people to citations of evangelicals versus non-evangelicals may have already been occurring in Habermas's discussion with Mike Licona 2 months ago, whereas Paulogia seems to think that he only made this radical shift from individuals to citations 1 month ago in the most recent Real Seekers interview. But the fact that he made the shift is the important point, not whether it was made 1 month ago or 2 months ago. So on this front, I totally agree and concur. Lydia McGrew is correct. At most, there is only one change of position or one shifting of the goalposts, if that's true, right? The non-Christian, more non-Christians to Christians as individual authors, to now more non-evangelical citations to evangelical citations. And we know this is correct if you look at the interview that Mike Licona did with Gary Habermas.
Oh, I know. It's something I wanted to ask you. So you were telling me earlier that someone had told you that there are several skeptics out there who are asking or they're really pushing back on you in a specific manner.
In this volume.
Yeah, in this volume.
Yeah.
About, I think it's, you cite, was it close to 6 or over 500 different scholars? More than 500 different scholars. So, but most of those that you have listed in the index are Christians. I think like 350. You said there are about 350 of those 550 are Christians.
I have not counted the index names and said how many. Oh, I see what you're saying. You mean people who write in this book? Yeah, it's been reported to me so far that there's been 3 different skeptical scholars who have said something like this. Habermas says he cites more critics, unbelieving of the resurrection critics, than he cites Christians. But when you go back and look at the names, I guess that's what you're getting at. When you go back and look at the names in the index, it looks like there's way more Christians in the index. Okay, fine. Instead of trying to nail a person on something and then tell everybody, imply the guy's being dishonest or something, well, why doesn't somebody ask me what I mean? And here's what I meant. When I say I'm citing far more critics than non-critics, from what I recall from my own count, about 1/3 of all the people in the book are evangelicals. About 2/3 are not evangelicals. So what I meant was, I have way more people who would not call themselves evangelicals whose critiques apply there. So I might give any simple question and have a list of 10 names. Maybe 7 of them, we do them alphabetically, by the way, maybe.
So just an important point here. He's talking about topic sections. And in my interview with Gary, he talks about that was Ben Shaw's idea. Originally, he wanted to put all the most skeptical all the way to the most conservative Christian in order, so that if any names were taken out by the publisher, it would be the Christians towards the end, and they would keep in the more skeptical or critics citations here. But Ben Shaw said, no, it's got to be in alphabetical order. So this is proof Gary has in mind here names within topic sections, right? Citations within topic sections. That's what he's talking about, not about the author index or the book as a whole.
Maybe a number of them are critics, and they go off on us, and maybe 1/3 of them are evangelicals. And so I have the mixture, but overall, I have way more citations for people who would not call themselves, as far as I understand, people who would not call themselves evangelicals.
Citations. See, this is why even Lydia has to admit that Paulogia is out to lunch and lying to you. He selectively edits to present a manipulative propaganda campaign against Gary. And even Dr. Lydia McGrew, who fell for it in the beginning, I read her posts and she talked about this threefold change in Gary's position. Even she has to admit, actually, maybe at most there were just 2 different positions. But that, according to Lydia, that's still bad in itself, that Gary made any switch at all in his position. It's not as bad as Paulogia's propaganda made it seem. But what about Lydia's fundamental objection? Look, even if he just changed from non-Christian to Christian authors overall in the book, and changed that to now number of scholarly citations between non-evangelical citations to evangelical citations within each topic section of his volume 3, well, he's still making that switch to get around the fact that Paulogia exposed him, right? That he lied about the contents of his volume 3, right? Well, let's get into that assessment of that issue next. Okay, so as to the main issue on the original more non-Christians versus Christian in total overall, the total authors claim, atheists such as the Rabyd Atheist have basically lied and exaggerated in their dishonesty about Gary here and been very deceptive, right? Paulogia and the Rabyd Atheist are in cahoots. They're working together to lie to people and present a picture that's not accurate. And the Rabyd Atheist in particular has gone on and said, oh, Gary has been very clear about more non-Christians than Christians. And he's said this several times in various interviews for years now. He's said this multiple times in multiple places.
But that's the breakdown. Like it's like 79% of the people in this book are Christians, when Gary made the claim that they were not. Okay, that the majority of them were not Christians. So, yeah, he's somewhat obsessive, but yes, but Gary absolutely lied here. Okay, he should have known better before making such a claim. He should have identified what these people's religion was, so he actually knew. But he's made this claim about this 3rd volume many times, that there was more non-Christians than Christians, and that's just patently untrue. 79% of them are Christian, which means vast majority of them are a Christian perspective. Okay, so that's not good research, by the way, just so you know.
So according to this atheist, Gary has said it many times. Well, is that true? I have looked at every single interview that Gary did going back 2 years ago when he first started going into details about his third volume and started promoting it. I can tell you this, the atheists are lying and exaggerating as usual. Let's take a look at every single interview that Gary has done while marketing his volume 3 in chronological order, giving you the not a selectively edited and manipulated video like Paulogia gives with his propaganda, serving an atheistic satanic agenda. I'm going to give you the full context quotes, everything where he's talking about, he's being asked about his third volume and what it contains. We start with the first interview, Dr. Sean McDowell interview called 50 Years Studying the Resurrection, Magnum Opus by Gary Habermas. This dates all the way back to January 16th, 2024. And this was the first interview I could find where Gary starts giving details about the contents of Volume 3.
Volume 3 is, I'm moving away from apologetics now with Volume 3.
Okay.
Volume 3 started out as 1,500 pages, and we've honed it down to about 800. And it is a who's who of liberal, all the way to very liberal atheist New Testament scholars, all the way to very conservative New Testament writers with credentials, very conservative, but PhD. And what we did was try to survey about 140. My research assistant said it's more like 200. He said he's the one that typed it up. About 140 questions minimum from Good Friday to the Ascension. So you got about 40 days here. And think of all the questions you could ask. Why the third day? How did Jesus appear? What's our earliest evidence? Every question you could think of. And all we do in Volume 3 is not argue for anything. We give a landscape view from really liberal to really conservative so everybody can see. I hope the guys who read it said that Volume 3 will be a basis for people doing MA theses and PhD dissertations because it links the field.
All right, so there you have it. Look, no mention at all of more non-Christians than Christians in Volume 3. Doesn't even mention Christians. Instead, he says the contrast is liberal versus conservative scholars. And at most, he says liberal, and it includes also very liberal, such as atheists scholars. So here, Gary doesn't mention anything about the ratio of Christians to non-Christians as individuals or as citations. The contrast is between liberal scholars versus conservative scholars, including very liberal scholars such as atheists. And they have PhDs. That's all we get starting 2 years ago in the Dr. Sean McDowell interview. So right away, you can see the atheists are lying. He hasn't said it multiple times from the beginning, where he's always said, there are not more non-Christian authors than Christian authors in total in all of my Volume 3. Go and read the author index and count them up. He's never said that. That's a lie from Paulogia and his buddy, the Rabyd Atheist. Okay, the next interview in chronological order, where Gary gives a little bit of details about his Volume 3, is on Mike Lacona's show in the Open Forum number 1. This is a show entitled Open Forum, live with Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona. This dates to September 29th, 2024. And let's take a look at that.
All 4 volumes are called On the Resurrection. The first volume is called Evidences.
Okay.
Second volume is called Refutations.
All right.
Third volume.
When's the third volume come out?
Not till next May. Since the first one came, they're 8 months apart.
Okay.
The first one just came out. The third volume is a research volume. We don't engage in the views. I say we. My longtime research assistant, Ben Shaw, I gathered, well, it's Ben's figure, 95% of the data. Ben edited it by retyping. We had to cut down from 1,500 to about 1,000 pages for Volume 3. But it's a who's who on where people are on key resurrection questions. Almost never do we jump in and give a view of our view. If they teach, we have a section, hallucinations. You teach hallucinations, you go down as hallucinations. We don't bicker with you. If you find somebody who teaches a swoon, they're a lot fewer and far between, but we just say so-and-so teaches a swoon. We don't give...
Gotcha.
Now,
this is Volume 3.
Volume 3. It's a kind
Volume
of...
2 was Naturalistic Explanations?
Yes, it's called Refutations.
Refutations. And what's Volume 4?
4 is something that I wanted to add. I've done some books on the resurrection be the center of theology and practice. But a lot of people say in reviews, all this guy talks about is evidence when he's going to do some pastoral stuff. So volume 4 has 2 major sections. Resurrection worked into a Christian worldview. What's it say about worldview? And what's it say about pastoral issues? Dealing with doubt, funerals, the suffering. What about suffering and resurrection? Really, and it's written, you'll notice a difference in volume 4 between part 1 and part 2, worldview questions, versus us having less references, less debate, and more discussion about what resurrection means for the practical life, practical Christian life.
All right, so as you see with that, back in September 29th, 2024, Dr. Michael Licona and Gary Habermas explains his 3rd volume. No mention of there being more non-Christian than Christian authors in volume 3 at all. Another lie from the Rabyd Atheist and Paulogia. And when Gary does describe those, the quote-unquote who's who, okay, spelled that wrong, it was typo, the who's who of scholarship, he focuses specifically on their mentions within individual sections. He highlights, for example, the section on hallucinations, not how many scholars are in the book as a whole. Very interesting. Paulogia himself was aware of these interviews and references. Okay, so now we come to my celebration panel show, the Ultimate Resurrection panel celebrating the legacy of Gary Habermas, dating May 16th, 2025, a day after Volume 3 was released. And this is where we get our first mention of the more non-Christians than Christians. So let's take a look at that clip in full context. Not just the manipulative and selectively edited version or propaganda that Paulogia gives you.
You have 4 volumes that are coming out. This isn't just a one and done book. This is covering all of your research in 4 different volumes. Just for the audience, do you want to kind of very briefly summarize what each of those volumes are about and what people can expect to find in them?
Volume 1, all 4 books are called On the Resurrection. And then there's one, and the subtitle that differentiates the books. The first book is called Evidence. And again, I've got to thank Mike and both for that. Called me one day, what volume are you going to do first? And because I had all the material there and we just had to pick, and I won't tell you which one I did, laugh at me, but I one that I thought should go first. And Ben said, no way, it's got to be Evidence first. And I said, no way, Ben, I'd rather prime the pot. First of all, I'd rather get people interested, drop the Evidence book on them. And I didn't know this, but little beknowns to me, Ben called Mike on the phone and they talked it over, not in my presence, and called me back and said, it's on my side. You got to do Evidence for the first volume. Then I was talking to Mike later. I said, Mike, is that true? He goes, Ben's exactly right, Doc. I don't know how you can do anything else. I don't even see a chance of doing one of the other ones first. And so it's because of Ben and Mike that the first volume is on Evidence. The second volume is called Refutations. And I emphasize they're mostly naturalistic alternatives, but they're not all naturalistic, because you've got Theodor Keim's 19th century, very influential German view that the tomb was not empty and Jesus was raised as a glorified spirit. He was not raised bodily. And so he's a supernaturalist. So they're not all natural theories, but any contrary theory, as the main ones, are in volume 2. With volume 3, people will find this out soon enough. But volume 3, I make a break with the apologetics per se. And I'm basically, there's more in the world than just apologetics. Volume 3 is on scholarly perspectives, and it's a who's who of people with terminal degrees in relevant fields. And I would define relevant fields as New Testament, theology, apologetics, philosophy, history, archaeology, classics. At people with terminal, not just anybody who sounds off in silly things. but it's a who's who of names across the board. And there are probably more skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Christian writers, let's say Jewish New Testament scholars. There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book, because like Tom Wright said years ago about his resurrection of Son of God book, he said, when he talked to ETS, he said, I didn't want to dog any of you evangelicals, but the point of my book was not to tell people about evangelicals. It was to tell people about non-evangelicals and how much agreement there is on these issues. I would say that's the theme of number 3. If you put a bunch of facts out there, and my 12 out there, and then shrink the list from 12 to 6, and that's the minimal facts, people are going to see how much agreement there is, but they're not arguing for the facts. They're just telling you where they are. So it's not really apologetics. It's where an atheist New Testament scholar is on this. It's where a committed evangelical with a degree, a terminal degree in an acceptable area, where they are. It's a who's who on, I don't know, Ben tells me well over 150 questions because he typed it up. He says over 150 questions from Good Friday to the Ascension. Now, there are other issues in there, but it's like, for example, that Jesus called himself deity. But mostly, and there's a whole section on that, but mostly Good Friday to the Ascension. How many questions can we ask, and where are these guys all the way across the board? And I purposely included non-Christians so that people wouldn't think this is a book from one of our evangelical schools and what we all think.
Right. So this is the infamous clip. It's clear. Look, Gary does mention that there are more non-Christians than Christians in the book. But there are a couple other things. When you see the full context that Paulogia manipulatively and selectively edits out, you see his full description of volume 3 here. We also see other things. Gary mentions a focus on the 150 sections, a mistake Paulogia has screwed up before, and he apologized for, so that's fine. But still, more non-Christians across the board, meaning across all sections, seems to be the focus here. Topic sections. And also, it's as you let him talk, he also speaks about differences between evangelicals and non-evangelicals. There are more non-evangelicals than evangelicals, and he contrasts non-Christians with evangelicals at one point in that thing. So it's clear, look, Gary is conflating non-Christians versus evangelicals and non-evangelicals with non-Christians, showing that he didn't necessarily mean, just from this clip alone, you can't just take him out of context. If you're being charitable and say, what did he mean? What did he intend to say by using the words more non-Christians than Christians? If you look at it in full context, it's not as clear cut as Paulogia is making it seem, because Gary has other terminologies. He's contrasting evangelicals with non-Christians now, and he's conflating non-evangelicals with non-Christians at times. So it's not necessarily clear, even in this clip, that Gary is intending to say there are more non-Christian authors than Christian authors in this book as a whole. Take a look at the author index, count it up and see. No, that's dishonest on the part of Paulogia. He's being manipulative there. It's understandable why he's misinterpreting this. I want to be fair. Obviously, Lily McGrew and that are misinterpreting it too. But I think where Paulogia is being a godless atheist is he's editing out parts where there's less clarity, there's ambiguity. What exactly does he mean by these terms? Why is he, if he's talking about Christians versus non-Christians, why is he contrasting that with evangelicals and non-evangelicals? And, these should raise questions or doubts as to what Gary is saying. He seems to be using terms interchangeably that should be, technically speaking, different, right? So this is a hint, this is a clue that it's not as simplistic as the atheists and skeptics want us to assume it is. Let's move on to our fourth interview with Frank Turek. But before we get to that, there is actually another interview that Gary did mentioning volume 3. I'll just show it for a second. And it's called Did Jesus Really Come Back to Life by the Tattooed Apologist. And in this, he mentions volume 3, but he doesn't get into any details. He just says, okay, I published volume 3, which is called Scholarly Perspectives. And the Tattooed Apologist says, oh, I've got to buy that. And then they move on. So there are no details. And that's why I didn't play a clip from this. But I just want to give credit that at the end of May, I think May 27th, 2025, Gary did this interview with the Tattooed Apologist on Did Jesus Really Come Back to Life? And he mentions his 4 volumes, including volume 3, but he doesn't go into a lot of details on it. So that's why I didn't play the clip. Now, on June 24th, 2025, Frank Turek interviewed Gary Habermas about his volume 3 on the Cross-Examined podcast. And this was a show entitled, What Do Critical Scholars Admit About Jesus with Dr. Gary Habermas? And let's play, again, in full context, no selective editing, everything Gary Habermas said when describing his volume 3 with Frank Turek.
Today we're going to lean more into the 3rd volume on the resurrection, Scholarly Perspectives. So here he is again, ladies and gentlemen, the great Dr. Gary Habermas, all the way from Liberty University. Gary, tell us an overview of this 3rd volume. I've spent at least 5 hours in this volume in the past couple of days. It's so easy to read and to see what people think, but tell people what's essentially in here.
Well, first of all, I didn't know this till I opened up the book when they sent it to me in the mail. But if you turn it sideways and look at the ends of the pages, you can see the dark lines going up. And those are the section headings in the book. Now, here's the way I explain it. Volumes 1 and 2 are apologetics. Mm-hmm. It's an argument for the resurrection and an argument against anti-resurrection arguments. But volume 3, I pretty much leave apologetics behind a bit. I should say because an up-and-coming young philosopher, Ben Shaw, who's got his PhD and funny story, but I'll let that go. A PhD in philosophy of history. He's also got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so don't mess with him. But Ben is the editor of this volume, mm-hmm. and his name is real small print, but it is there. It's big around the spine, and it's also inside. Because Ben took 1,500 pages of my notes and got them down to where when it came out in the book, it was about exactly 1,000 pages. It's like 996 pages or something in that book. But we're not doing apologetics. We're doing a who's who of everybody from the far left, and I mean the far left, to the far right. And here's my criteria. We'll interview anybody who is a scholar with a terminal degree, usually means a good doctorate, in a field that is relevant to resurrection studies. So you could have a PhD in philosophy, you could have a PhD in history, you got a PhD in New Testament, PhD in theology, PhD in classics, PhD in archaeology, PhD in comparative religion. And all those fields give you tools to be able to evaluate these arguments. And what we did was we picked a bunch of topics and we went through them, and all we did was give scholars' views from the far left to the far right. We have I counted, by the way, I think there's close to 600 different authors in that book. And of course, many times we use them way more than once. Ben, when he put the book together, Ben Shaw, Ben tells me there's just short of 8,000 footnotes in that book.
Oh, easily. So, yeah, 550 or more scholars, mm-hmm. and 8,000 endnotes. Hard to tell because it starts new with every section, but the footnotes. But these guys could be, and I counted them by name, and there's more atheists, agnostics, and other kinds of skeptics, or people who could be pretty conservative, but in a different religion. So they could be a conservative Jewish scholar who's not a Christian. So there could be a lot of, again, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and non-Christian religions Then there's a middle group. Let's call them moderates. And each group has like a minus, and a plus. There's a minus, a moderation in the middle, and a plus. That's how I think of them. And then conservatives. And yes, they're evangelical scholars. There are a lot of people say, well, evangelicals are not scholars. Well, look, my former teaching assistant before Ben has a PhD from Edinburgh in philosophy. Don't tell me that because he's a believer, he can't have anything good to say on this subject. With the PhD, from what I saw in a recent survey, was the seventh most influential university in the world. So there's a lot of guys on the right, they believe. A lot of guys on the far left, they don't believe. And all this book does is give views, and they're in alphabetical order. And I'm not saying there's never any comebacks. Once in a while, we make brief comments. This is kind of a silly view because, but for the most part, we make no comments. So you could say, did Jesus die on the cross? And you can get views all the way from the right to all the way on the left. And you might be amazed that a number of the Jesus Seminar guys, a number of the renowned skeptics and atheists, they have no problem with death by crucifixion. In fact, I even have a section in there in the middle of facts. Now you say, well, I thought you weren't doing apologetics. I'm not. I'm only listing the minimal facts as historical facts, and I'm telling you how scholars line up underneath them, yay, nay, in between, with no response. If I don't like what somebody says about one of the facts, I don't sit there and pick fights with the guy. I just reproduce his view and give you a source. So we try to go through all kinds of topics, basically related to Christ. Toward the end of the book, Frank, there's a long section where I think there's 100 people in there, and they respond to each other. So this is really funny. You got the atheists critiquing atheists. You got evangelicals critiquing evangelicals. You got evangelicals going off on atheists, and atheists going off on evangelicals. All they do is they give the views, and I just let it sit. I didn't offer refutations.
Wow, so that interview gave a lot of details. Once again, Gary mentions a spectrum, far left skeptics to far right evangelicals. No mention of more non-Christians versus Christian authors. Doesn't say that. He's focused on the topic sections, section focus, right? And he goes into specific topics where he argues this and that sort of thing, and talking about citations, talking about things like the scholars on scholars section. And there's a couple other areas where he's talking about the citations of the authors and the focus on footnotes. Paulogia found out, why does Gary keep talking about 8,000 footnotes? Why is that relevant? In my celebration, his response show to my celebration panel review show, well, the 8,000 footnotes are most important compared to the number of authors because Gary's thinking of the citations in each section. How many citations do we give for these skeptical scholars within each section? And you're getting these hints, even in these interviews where he's not consciously trying to respond to Paulogia's criticisms yet, kind of thing, right? He doesn't even know about them yet, doesn't know or care about them, but we're still getting these hints. He's topic section focused, citation focused, 8,000 footnotes kind of thing. And he heard that there's 600 authors, meaning he didn't care to count them before because the authors were irrelevant. It was the number of citations from these skeptical scholars. And it makes perfect sense because the way Gary organized it is by topic sections, then names, and then how many citations each name has, and that sort of thing. But we're not there yet. So in this interview, Gary mentions counting them by name, yes, because by name is how he organizes it, per topic, name, then the number of citations and what each of those names say. But he seems to me that the names in the citations of the footnotes for each section, he conflates evangelicals and versus atheists here. And he uses various terms, again, far left, far right, non-Christians, evangelicals, atheists. There are a bunch of terms being used somewhat haphazardly here and interchangeably from what Gary's saying. Skeptics, another vague unspecified term. You could have skeptics who are Christians, right? So what exactly do we mean by Christians here? It's not clear. And there's enough ambiguity here and questioning that Paulogia and Lydia McGrew have the obligation as reasonable persons. They ought to have not inferred Gary was lying and literally meant there are more non-Christian authors than Christian authors. That was unjustified given the full context of the material. I get on Lydia's part, she was just working with Paulogia's manipulated and edited video. And yeah, I myself kind of fell for it. But once you go and look at the clips in full context, it's inexcusable. There's enough confusion with the terminology here to go, if I'm going to be charitable to Gary, I need more details. I'm Lydia McGrew. I'm friends with Gary. I've been friends with Gary personally for decades or years at the very least. Let me reach out to him personally and ask, hey, I watched these clips and this troubles me. What are you saying when you say this? What does this mean? And then you can assess, does that make sense? At the very least, judge the full context video clips, right? Atheists, he also differentiates atheists from skeptics. But elsewhere, Gary says or implies that there are such thing as Christian skeptics, like I said. So, yeah, that's what we gained from the Frank Turek interview. Very interesting points here. Let's move on to the next. Mike Lacona's Open Forum number 2. This dates to September 20th, 2025, called The Unfiltered Discussion, Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona.
This came out, what, May?
May 15th.
On the Resurrection, Volume 3, Scholarly Perspectives.
Yeah, and for most people who say all Habermas does is write on pro and get good and bad refutations and pro treatments of the resurrection, this one is really not apologetic. There's some apologetics in there, but that is like a who's who, or I like to call that volume a critical lay of the land. Where are we at present in a critical lay of the land? My editor, his name's in the book there, Ben Shaw. Ben tells me there's almost 8,000 footnotes in that volume. So we try to survey a lot of sources. I think just a little short of 600 different scholars, but we use many of the scholars, we cite them over and over.
Okay.
Depending on the topic we're talking about.
931 pages of text, 968 pages, including the indices.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and again, we're not trying to prove anything. I want to be clear. Ben and I, we put a lot of non-Christian, they call themselves non-Christians. That's why I say, if someone's calling themselves non-Christian, I feel like I can call them non-Christian. A lot of skeptics, I have their theories in there, and I'm real open about what they say against the resurrection, and we just state it. We don't refute it. We either quote them or we paraphrase them, but we let it stay. We don't sit there and think, oh no, we've got to give some refutations. That's why it's a lay of the land. It's a who's who, critics and non-critics.
Okay. Oh, I know something I wanted to ask you. So you were telling me earlier that someone had told you that there are several skeptics out there who are asking or they're really pushing back on you in a specific manner.
In this volume.
Yeah, in this volume.
Yeah.
About, I think it's, you cite, was it close to 6 or over 500 different scholars? More than 500 different scholars. So, but most of those that you have listed in the index are Christians. I think like 350. You said there are about 350 of those 550 are Christians.
I have not counted the index names and said how many. Oh, I see what you're saying. You mean people who write in this book? Yeah, it's been reported to me so far that there's been 3 different skeptical scholars who have said something like this. Habermas says he cites more critics, unbelieving of the resurrection critics, than he cites Christians. But when you go back and look at the names, I guess that's what you're getting at. When you go back and look at the names in the index, it looks like there's way more Christians in the index. Okay, fine. instead of trying to nail a person on something and then tell everybody, imply the guy's being dishonest or something, well, why doesn't somebody ask me what I mean? And here's what I meant. When I say I'm citing far more critics than non-critics, from what I recall from my own count, about 1/3 of all the people in the book are evangelicals. About 2/3 are not evangelicals. So what I meant was, I have way more people who would not call themselves evangelicals whose critiques apply there. So I might give any simple question and have a list of 10 names. Maybe 7 of them, we do them alphabetically, by the way, maybe a number of them are critics and they go off on us. And maybe 1/3 of them are evangelicals. And so I have the mixture. But overall, I have way more citations for people who would not call themselves, as far as I understand, people who would not call themselves evangelicals.
Okay. How are you defining evangelical?
Well, let's use a real general definition. I'm not going to say somebody who believes this definition or that definition about inspiration or that kind of stuff. I'd say evangelicals are people in general who take the Bible seriously. They take the Bible as their guide. They take the Bible as the book out of which we preach. But most of all, I define evangelicals, the Greek word evangelios, and it refers to somebody who preaches the good news of the gospel, which I think is the way, like, for example, Mark says, and he begins his gospel saying when Jesus came forward, he was preaching the gospel. And that's where we get the word evangelical. So there's no doctrinal test for who we call evangelical. It's kind of like saying conservatives and non-conservatives, if that helps. I don't know.
All right, so look, as you see, again, mentions 8,000 footnotes and 600 scholars, but we cite them over and over again, citation focused here, depending on the section in question. A lot of non-Christians and skeptics quoted in there. So non-Christians aren't equated with skeptics. Who's who of critics and non-critics? Again, going back to the Dr. Sean McDowell first interview, right? Critics versus non-critics is the spectrum. And he conflates critics versus Christians. And also evangelicals versus non-evangelicals is in there as well. And contrasting critics with evangelicals and that sort of thing. And he says evangelicals versus non-evangelicals is akin in his mind to conservatives versus non-conservatives, aka liberals. Remember, I think it was the second interview we had from the far left, the liberal scholars to the conservative scholars. Those were in a couple of the other things. So you can see all of these terminologies are getting conflated and used interchangeably. At the same time, they're also differentiated at times. So there's an element of confusion in the terminology a little bit, or questions. It's not crystal clear. And finally, he mentions 2 of 3 citations were from non-evangelicals per section, each topic section. And he's topic section focused. He mentions they're listed alphabetically. Well, we know from our interviews, my interview with Gary Habermas, that he's talking about Ben Shaw was the one who said we have to put all the names of citation and their citations, right? Multiple citations per name in each topic section. Those have to be listed in alphabetical order. So again, it's section focused here. So this is very interesting. This is in the round 2 response. And remember, even Lydia McGrew herself admits that Gary was speaking of scholarly citations here, not scholars. Paulogia was wrong. Paulogia was lying. Paulogia selectively edited to make it sound, the clip, to make Gary sound like he was talking about names in the author index. There are from more non-Christians to Christian authors in the index to more non-evangelicals to evangelical authors in the author index. That's never what Gary ever said in any of these video clips. And even Lydia McGrew was smart enough to see past Paulogia's manipulation there, at least after she thought about it and realized actually Paulogia's out to lunch on that one. Okay, Finally, number 6, the last clip available. This is my skeptical response show. Round 3 response, the interview that I did that Paulogia did his latest video on. And this is called Gary Habermas' Response to the Skeptics on his On the Resurrection, Volume 3, Scholarly Perspectives, dated October 3rd, 2025. Let's take a look and see what Gary says on that front.
I know that it's been estimated you cite about 558 authors, judging by the author index and stuff like that. So
All right.
I'm just kind of curious, like, okay, how did you select? Why only 558 of the 6,000 sources and stuff? How did you select these people, these authors, as opposed to others?
I think we have different numbers here. I think by 558, you're probably talking individual scholars.
Right.
But what if one of these scholars has 10 sources, another one has 15? And some of the guys who have the relevant literature, there are a number of guys who have multi sources. So now if you ask me the question, how many of the 6,000 that you and Ben looked at, how many of them you did ask me that. You started with how many actual scholars. Dale, I don't know the answer to that. I've never checked. I don't know how many scholars. Maybe it's and you could say, well, there's, what'd you say, 5 what? I've not counted.
558 is what some people have counted.
I couldn't have told you that, but that's individual people. All right, then you got to ask, how many were in the 1,500 that didn't make it in this, that got cut out? You asked that question earlier. What got cut out? The additional, let's say this 1,000-page book was 1,100 written pages. There's still 400 pages there. I want to know what I want to know. I've never talked to him because it's not that big a deal to me. But I feel like asking Ben, hey, dude, who all did you leave out of this one, Or did you get tired of reading somebody's name, or you thought somebody's comment was really stupid, or maybe you thought it was really positive, but too positive because the guy doesn't look at it critically, and you left off the conservative, which I've done before. So I don't know how many individual people, but that maybe five for me. I don't have a count. Maybe 5 for me, maybe additional 1,000 that been used that are not in mine, but in my count. But that would go back to his MA thesis before we started working together, and then 13 years where he was paid to do regular research in a fair number of hours per week. So I don't know how many.
Fair enough.
How many separate authors? I'm only talking about how many publications.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, when I say somebody might have 10, what if they have 10 books and 14 journal articles relevant? And you go, well, I know that guy. He doesn't have 14 on the resurrection. No, but how many things does he have as relevant? Does he critique the mythicists and not even mention resurrection? Does he? I've got a book over here on my shelf. It's one of my favorite books. 50 Reasons the Resurrection Should Make a Difference in Our Personal Lives. Okay, well, that's very creative. And I've told that author, I know him, and I've told him I love his book. So these are all from different, everybody thinks I'm the stat counter. I don't actually count that many. I estimate.
Yeah.
For the most part.
And another thing that you mentioned that I think is important in terms of, focusing on the literature rather than number of scholars. Well, what happens if a single scholar has one opinion at time one and then changes their mind or something like that? So in that case, it is helpful to keep track of the literature and any changes and stuff like that as well. So.
Yeah, I think you told me one time, Dale, and this doesn't come from my account because I don't read or count these things, but you told me that a few scholars, I think you said 3, but a few, I'm not being specific, I didn't do the research. A few of them were saying that I've said in lectures that I cite more evangelicals than non-evangelicals, but I claimed that I do more on the left side than on the right side, and they went back and said, no, you got far more evangelicals. Okay. Because I've heard that from other people besides you, I went back and did a head count, if you can imagine. I don't know which one I did. I don't know if I did volume 1. No, sorry, this volume 3. I counted volume 3.
And it was almost, I mean, the percentage points, I didn't convert the numbers to percentages, but of everybody who cited, about 3/4 of the citations were to non-evangelicals, and about 1/4 evangelicals. That's 3-1. But if their point, I don't know, but if their point is, well, I counted the names and there were way more evangelical names. Okay, but what about what I just said a little while ago? That I would prefer, I mean, literally prefer uh, a Ludeman or a Crossley or a Crossen or anybody, those names, or even the Mythers. I would put them higher in the list than I would put evangelicals. And when I get down to evangelicals, I would know maybe 10 who said something like this, and I picked the best 3. That's how I did it through the whole. Nobody has to believe me, but that's the way I did it. So it's not how many names are in the book. There might be more evangelicals than non-evangelicals, but I counted them here, and there were 3 times as many people who don't want to be called evangelicals, as far as I know, and I know a good deal of them personally. I don't think they would want to be, but that's my judgment of who they were. But 3-1, and the evangelicals are much outnumbered, and that's what I mean in interviews when I say I count a I count far more, I think, non-evangelicals than evangelicals, and I think that's fair. Not by just counting heads. That's kind of to me, superficial, because that doesn't, if Crossan, I'm just making something up, if Crossan is cited 52 times, and my favorite evangelical is cited 15 times, I think that gives the upper hand to the non-evangelical. Oh, no. What are they going to do? Say, no, that's 1 point for each. That's just a silly comment.
Yeah.
You know?
Now, it so happens that when counting during round 1, I captured the scholar's denomination if it was readily available in the search. I attempted to classify the denominations as evangelical or non-evangelical, but the available information for many scholars was entirely underdeterminate for me to be comfortable. So I made 3 categories for evangelical: yes, no, and maybe. Unlike Gary, I'll put a link to my counting spreadsheet in the description for your critique. So, based on number of citations, here's what I got. 21% yes, 26% maybe, and 53% no. The good news for Gary is that if he'd stuck to his simple majority claim, he'd have been vindicated. At most, 47% of the references are evangelical. So I'm comfortable saying it's very slightly mostly non-evangelical. However, with his new boast of 3-1 non-evangelical, he needs pretty much no one in the maybe category to count as evangelical. That seems pretty implausible to me, but statistically possible. You know what? I'm just going to let Gary have this one. He can say that the references are 3-1 non-evangelical if he wants.
Okay, so it looks like part of my video got cut off there, so I'll just re-record this now. But what is my conclusion regarding this second objection of Lydia McGrew's, where Gary apparently changed his mind from saying there was more non-Christian authors compared to Christian authors in the book as a whole, versus the new claim of the scholarly site. There's more scholarly citations, the ratio of 3-1 confirmed by Paulogia, of citations from non-evangelical scholars compared to evangelical scholars. Well, my take is this, just in a nutshell, is Gary, in terms of the trilemma, he is not a liar. There's a provable consistency all the way from January 2024 all the way to now, where he is focused on each topic section and mentions names and publications or citations associated with those topic sections rather than the book as a whole, as though he has in mind count up the authors in the author index and find that out. That's not what he was ever talking about. It was always based on individual topic sections and how many names are there and their citations. And we know that he is so he's apparently conflating these two things, because that makes sense, because the way his volume 3 is organized is through, okay, what is the topic section, whatever it is, the Ascension or something like that, how many names or scholars do we have start in alphabetical order, and then how many citations do we give for each of those names, each of those scholars. And it makes sense. Okay, Gary counted up the names and the citations per name, and that's what he has in mind when he's talking about more non-Christians than Christians. He simply misspoke there and meant to say more non-evangelicals or skeptics or critics. And we also saw that Gary oftentimes is ambiguous with his terminology. Atheists, skeptics, critics versus non-critics, liberals versus conservatives, Christians versus non-Christians, evangelicals versus non-evangelicals, those on the far left, those on the far right. And he uses these words interchangeably at times and sometimes differently and distinguishes them. And because of this, I think the reasonable person, taking everything in full context, ought to go, look, Gary has been totally consistent and truthful in terms of what he intended to say when he used the words non-Christians, more non-Christians than Christians in the panel show he did with me, whereby he immediately, in that same show, starts talking about evangelicals versus non-Christians and stuff like that. So my conclusion here is Gary is not lying. He is being always and has been truthful. And in fact, his numbers have been confirmed by Paulogia the Atheist. And secondly, he's not a lunatic either, because again, proved by Paulogia and that sort of thing, his numbers, once we found out what he actually intended to say or meant, conforms to reality. And a lunatic, that would just be impossible. If he was making stuff up on an ad hoc basis to respond to Paulogia, he wouldn't be getting these things right. And especially across over 2 years, he wouldn't be giving these subtle hints that he is referring to footnotes, citations, the number of citations each name within each topic section gives. There is this consistent trend of being topic focused, number of footnotes focused, or citations focused, or publications focused, within the number of scholars and names. And once we see how Volume 3 is formatted, it makes perfect sense. It's organized by topic, then the names of the scholar, and then followed by what they said in the list of publications they have, how many citations each name or scholar has. So this makes sense as to why Gary is sometimes conflating things in a way that leads to confusion for people if they're not being charitable. Now, that said, Gary's not perfect here. I do find some fault with Gary as a communicator. He's still a great leader, but sometimes he's an ineffective or confusing communicator. And that comes across when he conflates these terms, and he conflates without explaining fully names versus citations, right? It's clear after the fact, in 2020 hindsight, what he meant, because, yeah, we see the way he's organized the citations under each name, under each topic section. So it makes perfect sense, and he's totally truthful and on point with what he's saying there. I just wish he was communicated from the beginning a bit more clearer and said, we organize it by sections, then we have the names, and then we have the different citations. Sometimes a name will have 3 or 5 citations. Sometimes they just have 1. Sometimes they have 2. Kind of thing, right? So we cite we cite publications for each name, and sometimes there's more than one publication or citation or footnote per name in each section. So had he clearly communicated that was his focus, rather than talking about authors total in the book as a whole, that would have helped clarify some of the confusion here. Secondly, also using terminology in a more consistent way. You know, atheists, critics, skeptics, far left, far right. He should have been clear. Evangelicals versus non-evangelicals, and Christians versus non-Christians. I wish he would be more clear and consistent in what these terms mean for him within the context of Volume 3 and how those terms operate and that sort of thing. But it looks like Gary was using these terms, the truth is, in a haphazard way. We generally understand what he means. I think the final thing is he's meaning non-evangelicals or critics of the individual topics and or the resurrection as a whole versus the non-critics or Christians or aka evangelicals. That's what he truly has in mind, and with their focus on citations. So it ultimately comes down to that. But yeah, Gary could have communicated a bit better, but none of that means that he's a bad leader or he's a liar or a lunatic. No, he is a great leader and scholar that he has always been, deserves to be respected. Nothing about this changes anything. And Gary has always had this. He's always been a bit loose and speaks off the cuff. He's a very talkative person, an extrovert, and he's not always careful or considerate in the terminology that he uses. And guess what? I'm the same way. I'm not a liar or a lunatic, but sometimes I could be better at communicating or communicating more clearly as to what I mean, because sometimes I have things in my head which aren't translating in the words that I'm actually saying and can cause confusion with somebody who doesn't have the same background knowledge as to what I'm talking about. So that's my critique here. Gary is a leader. He's not a liar or a lunatic, but even as a leader, he's not perfect. He could perhaps communicate better, more clearly, more consistently for the sake of the audience so as to avoid confusion. And that seems to be what's really happened here. Gary knows what he's talking about in full context. We can put the pieces together and understand exactly what he was saying, but it takes effort. If you just hear him talking off the cuff in one interview or out of context in Apologia thing, it's perfectly understandable why Lydia McGrew and the Christians might be confused and think that Gary was claiming there are more non-Christian authors in total in this entire book compared to Christians in total in this entire book. Those explicit words were stated, right? That there are more non-Christians than Christians. And the natural assumption is to assume, okay, he's talking about in total in the whole book. If I count up the authors, it'll be that. But that's not what he meant or intended to say. And look, he's admitted he misstated. He misspoke in the interview that he did with me and possibly with Frank Turek. But there's enough evidence there on the same end that Christians like Lydia McGrew ought to have known, reasonably inferred better, and have had reasonable doubts and said, no, I'm not warranted in concluding Gary's a liar or dishonest here, because he seems to be using words and terminology haphazardly here. That's my hint, that's my cue to be charitable and maybe reach out to Gary in a private email and just, what you keep saying this stuff, what exactly do you mean here? Because it sounds like you're contradicting yourself or you've changed your position now, let me really look back at what you said in full context and evaluate if your answer makes sense. If you have been consistent the whole time, but maybe you've just been misspeaking or miscommunicating in some way, and that's led to me being confused. That's what the charitable thing would have been to do here, because nothing here indicates Gary's a liar, nothing indicates he's losing his mind or is a lunatic or suffering from dementia or anything like that. No, he's totally with it. It's the exact opposite. So Gary is a leader, albeit a leader who could perhaps improve his communication skills to be clearer and more consistent with his terminology. Okay, so let's move on to number 3. All right, so the next one is the no precise head count. And basically the objection is Gary Habermas claimed he did a precise or rigorous head count of scholars for 6 minimal facts, but now we found out that he didn't. He never did that except for the empty tomb. And there are the clips from Paulogia. I'm not going to play them again because I went over everything and lost the recording, so I'm just going to save time here. And basically, Lydia McGrew also says this, right? So she has her little post here, which she says, and there's more. In the most recent attempt, damage control 1 month ago on Real Seekers, Habermas discussed a point that is much more important to his method, namely his claiming for decades that he has the receipts showing that a vast majority of scholars endorse his minimal facts, but more recently saying that he never did a head count. This is a truly wild backtrack, which I myself have talked about on my YouTube channel because that started a year ago in conversation with Dr. Mike Licona. So there's nothing new here, right? So I don't see any reason why Lydia McGrew is now calling Gary dishonest. He doesn't deserve that compared to what she hypothesized in her own video as to the explanation for why Gary said he did a head count, but now he's saying he never did a head count. Is he contradicting himself? Is he lying? Is he being dishonest? Absolutely not. In the first place, it's an undeniable fact that Gary did, as of 2012, use words like head counts or counts. I've never seen him use tallies. And he gives the strong impression, implicitly at least, that he's keeping some kind of records, official records on this. It's also an undeniable fact that as of 2024 and 2025, Gary has admitted that he's not done any such rigorous head counts except for the empty tomb, which he now places at 80.1 to 80.2% of scholarly acceptance. So this is what Gary himself says about the apparent contradiction in my skeptical response interview with him.
Well, here's a question. I have to admit, even I myself, when I first heard, this was from a clip you did with Mike Lacona about a year ago. And I admit, I was myself was a little confused, and I reached out to you obviously to ask you about it. But you did kind of mention there that you said this quote that I only ever did a head count for the empty tomb. I never did a head count for the other minimal facts. And to my mind, that did, like, I was like, what? I thought you said differently. So I just want to, do you want to kind of explain, like, what did you mean by that? Like, what do you mean you only did the head count?
It's not a minimal fact. But in other words, I never did it for any of the minimal facts to my memory. But what it is was, when I'm talking about these huge piles of journal articles and books, 100 shelves here, and all kinds of stuff that I have on all subjects related, but resurrection is those journal articles. They're not ones that are non-resurrection. When I put all those together, I stopped and counted all the ones I had, again, where guys I've cited that are more non-evangelical than evangelical. So I thought it was pretty fair. And in my earlier study, before I wrote these volumes, I had some articles that came out. And I said that the count for the empty tomb that I saw was 75. Then a rash of skeptical sources came out about that time, and I lowered it. And I said, well, I've said 75 before, but let me move it to 67 to 75. Okay, for volume 2, I did a head count of all the guys, as far as I know, that I have or knew about. And I didn't do it this way so it'd come to a nice round 80. But when I divided the scholars pro and con, it came out with 80.1% pro empty tomb or probably pro empty tomb. And what would the other view be? 19.9, whatever. Not empty tomb or probably not empty. You say, why'd you count probably empty tomb? Because I counted probably not empty tomb too. That's just the way I chose to do it. But I had all these guys here, so I thought I might as well count. But the minimal facts are so well accepted, I think I'm going to be, if you said, well, hey, why don't you just do a study of all the guys who are agnostic over, or very skeptical / agnostic or over, what would it be on Jesus didn't die on the cross? I'm going to be counting for a long time before I find hardly anybody. I think there are 3 major things in in the New Testament that are allowed most times. I don't have a head count, but Jesus died by crucifixion. Secondly, his major teaching was the kingdom of God. The book of Mark starts out not with the Christ child, but with Jesus came forward preaching, repent, for the kingdom of God is here. So that's his subject matter. And then not the resurrection per se, but the disciples thought they saw appearances of the risen Jesus. So there's a lot of religions where I'm willing to say so-and-so thought they saw something, but I don't say that's not by a mile from they saw something. And I'm always careful to say in my second fact, the disciples had experiences that they thought were appearances. Those 3 are very widespread. And you got Ehrman and Ludemann and Crossan and Borg who'll say yeah, the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus. You're giving me that one, you won't have a problem with the crucifixion and the problem that the kingdom of God was his chief teaching. But I'll tell you this, who doesn't believe the kingdom of God is his chief teaching? I don't know what percentage, but a fair number of the Jesus Seminar guys don't. And a whole bunch of other scholars will say, yeah, they don't think it was his major teaching, but like they're talking to the choir. They're talking to themselves. That's what other skeptical guys say. So, no, I can give you where I think people are, but the empty tomb's the only one I counted on.
All right, now on terms of the evaluation, remember we have the trilemma. Is Gary a liar, lunatic, or leader within the Christian church? Well, my evaluation here, I don't think Gary was deliberately or maliciously lying here. That seems to be clear from what I know of him personally, as well as from the way he's known by everybody who knows him and that sort of thing. In fact, the evidence doesn't seem to be indicate that he was deliberately or maliciously lying. Like, hey, I'm going to come up with this plan where I'm going to say I'm have a head count and then spring it on them that I don't have one. That's just ridiculous. And even Dr. Lydia McGrew provides a complete hypothesis or explanation that I think is true, that doesn't entail Gary deliberately lying for nefarious purposes.
But I want to move on to something else. We can say that he's wrong about whether he claimed a percentile head count, because that's published, that's out there. When it comes to his saying that he didn't do a head count, even by his own lights, even using his own interpretations, we can't say that he's wrong there, because we don't have any such head counts, right? I mean, Lucano bursts out in the live stream, but you've done all these counts over the years, and Habermas says no, only on the empty tomb. All right, but we don't have any other counts, and volume 3 seems to indicate that we're not going to get them. All right, volume 3 is a list of, this scholar said this scholar said this scholar said this, and there are issues with some of the interpretations, but it never claims to be laying out, M out of N of all scholars and X out of Y of all skeptical scholars acknowledge this proposition. So could he be right? I think he could be right in what he said in that live stream 11 months ago. Maybe he didn't actually make rigorous head counts, although what he said did strongly imply that. What is some other evidence we have that maybe he didn't make rigorous head counts? Well, besides the statement in the live stream, there is the statement in volume 3. I'm not gonna, what I'm giving you here isn't the evidence of the head counts. This isn't the head counts. If he really had notes that record these head counts, those would have been very interesting to publish, or even a chart with all of, all the scholars listed and how they're categorized as far as their place on the scholarly spectrum, and what position they take, yes, no, on this fact and this fact and this fact, and, what publication, that conclusion is based on. And then, you could just do the math from there. It's not there. Now, I have a suggestion about what I think might have happened. I'm not going to claim this is something we can know. This is a suggestion, but I'm trying to explain this data. I think perhaps Dr. Habermas substituted in his own mind reading and summarizing a very large number of articles and then getting a strong impression from all of that work of reading and, by his own lights, accurately summarizing those articles. He substituted that in his own mind for making a head count in the sense of, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, count them up. All right, and continuing to do so. Now, to be clear, given what I have recently discovered about major problems with his interpretations, even if I did have such a chart, I'm not just going to accept that, especially on items of special interest, without chasing down the publications and drawing my own conclusions, because I found so many problems with his interpretations. But we don't even have that. And I'm thinking maybe he's now correct to say that he didn't do some kind of comprehensive head count. If that happened, I think it would explain the evidence that he made notes on a huge ton of articles. In one place, he says 3,400 articles. And he came in his own mind to think that his impression, based on reading and making notes in so many articles, was tantamount to a head count, because it wasn't just a guess based on sort of incidentally encountering articles. Rather, it was a guess. It was still a guess, but based upon going out and intentionally reading a huge number of articles. And I think there is evidence to support this. Listen to the flow of what he writes in 2012. So this is going to be rereading part of what I read before and kind of going on. So the question he's answering is this based on something between a rough guess and an estimate? To answer this question, in my case, what began as a rather modest attempt to update my resurrection bibliography grew by large increments until it developed into a full-blown attempt to catalog an overview of recent scholarship. The study dominated 5 straight years of my research time, as well as long intermittent stretches after that. Apparently, I was not very successful at drawing boundaries. An ongoing study that classified at least the major publications on these topics, continuing on through other representative sources. I counted a very wide spectrum of scholarly views, tracing the responses to about 140 sub-issues or questions related to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. My bibliography is presently at about 3,400 sources and counting, published originally in French, German, or English. Initially, I read and cataloged the majority of these publications, charting the representative authors' positions, topics, and so on, concentrating on both well-known and obscure writers alike across the entire skeptical to liberal to conservative spectrum. As the number of sources grew, I moved more broadly into this research, trying to keep up with the current state of resurrection research. So I think maybe he's been thinking that it's not just an educated guess, because it's based on an impression that he got from what started as maybe an attempt to make a continual rigorous count, but then eventually didn't continue with that. And yet, nonetheless, I've been reading these, I've been footnoting these. It's over 3,400 articles, blah, blah, blah. And interestingly, in a very recent live stream, this was just recorded between Habermas and Lacona a couple weeks ago, the emphasis is there are over 8,000 footnotes in Volume 3. And he talks about his editor and assistant, Ben Shaw. Ben Shaw tells me that there are over 8,000 footnotes in that volume. Well, over 8,000 footnotes isn't a head count, okay? So again, this sort of flow of his research and his description of the flow of his research, I think confirms my suggestion that he never did a fully comprehensive, rigorous head count, even by his own lights, but that he did a whole lot of reading and annotating and therefore thought that he wasn't just making a guess, and that justified using words like counts and tallies.
So there you have it. I think Lydia McGrew is bang on here. And she admits in her own objection that nothing has changed. Literally nothing has changed in the interview that I did with Gary Habermas and that Paulogia picked up on in the video. So this hypothesis is still by far the better hypothesis compared to saying Gary's a deliberate liar, a mastermind genius who lied for decades about doing a head count, meaning it literally, snickering to himself, and then all of a sudden at the last minute he spills the beans and says there's no head count. That just doesn't make sense with all the data from Dr. Gary Habermas. And me and Lydia know Gary personally. I'm not sure about Lydia and Gary's current relationship and stuff like that, but certainly they've been friends for years, just like I've been friends with Gary. So that's just impossible to be true, extremely implausible to be true. Gary dishonest doesn't follow here. And Lydia McGrew herself admits this in her complaint. The only thing she says, yeah, but I just don't like the way Gary spoke. When he was speaking off the cuff in Dale's podcast, he used the word, well, I'm giving my opinion off the top of my head. yeah, that doesn't sound great. That just sounds like, oh, I'm just popping it out of nowhere with no basis in reality. But that's not clearly not what Gary was saying in full context on my show. And we saw the full clip of what he said. So that's irrelevant to my mind. Just needs to be more careful with the words he uses. So therefore, we've proven from Lydia McGrew, and I think she did an excellent case, that Gary's not a deliberate, malicious liar. That doesn't explain this data. I think what happened is he made this conflation in his head about, and used the words imprecisely about a head count or counting to describe his literature review, very extensive literature review, and his recollections of that based on categorizing the readings and making his own notes. And look, in terms of this happens all the time with human beings. I myself, I've been called out for saying sloppily or being careless when I say, Stirp proved there was no paint on the shroud images at all. No paint at all, right? And this is from their official statement, Stirp's statement as well. But ultimate shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry and others will be quick to point out and say, that's not correct. They found paint particles. They found paint particles. So you're lying, aren't you? No, because clearly I know that they found minute traces of contamination paint particles. Nobody denies that. No one cares. Stirp knows that. Everybody proved that, and no one cares. The point is, they had nothing to do with the image formation of the shroud's body or bloodstain images. And that's what the science absolutely proves. And that's why we say there is no paint found on the shroud that's responsible for creating the images. Neither are the images composed of paint, as Walter McCroney said. So that's the point. But people, I'm sure Paulogia could do a quick little edit and make me seem like I'm contradicting myself or I'm dishonest, because he could show a clip of me admitting, yeah, there are some contamination paint particles that fell onto the shroud over the centuries and that sort of thing through ordinary contamination processes. And then another clip saying there's no paint on the shroud. Is that a contradiction? Have I been lying? No, it's just I've conflated this way of saying that there's no paint on the shroud, just like Stirp did when I quote Stirp's conclusions, word for word, by the way. This is what they're doing. But they're not intending to say, well, there is no paint particles at all, not even one single paint particle through contamination. No, they've always admitted that. I've always admitted that. It's just we've become entrenched in this way of saying it, probably based on the fact the way the Stirp conclusion is written on the shroud.com website. And we like to follow the scientists and their quotes and that sort of thing. Now, would it be ideal and better? I would be a better communicator for sure, less careless if I did qualify it each time. That would be better. I admit that. But that doesn't mean that I'm dishonest when I don't add the qualification. The shroud, there's no paint on the shroud except for minute trace contamination particles that have nothing to do with the images and how they were formed. I don't have to say that each time, you know. If I'm asked about it, I can give that qualification, but I admit it would be better and clearer for the audience if I if I stated it that way. And that's the same thing that happened with Gary Habermas here. He should have been more clear. Hey, I've done all the area literature review. I've read all of the papers, so I have an informed estimation based on my recollection and note taking from all of the readings I've done. Here's what 90% of scholars believe in the minimal facts. That would have been better compared to using words like a head count or a count. But it's totally acceptable within normal humanity to make this swap. But here's where Lydia in her private communication says, no, if this is true and he wasn't deliberately lying, this means he's delusional. He's mentally deficient. He's a quote unquote lunatic, for lack of a better words. That conflating an actual head count with your area readings or literature surveys, there's got to be something seriously wrong with your mental capacities here. So is this true? Is this the best explanation? Gary has become a lunatic and doesn't know. Apparently since 2012, he's been a lunatic, has been conflating a head count with his area readings or his literature surveys. No, this is clearly not the explanation, because once again, I can personally avow Gary Habermas is perfectly sane. His interviews prove that. Yes, he's not a perfect communicator, as we've seen. He can do better there. Sometimes he's a bit sloppy or careless when he's using certain terminologies and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that he's lost his mind or he's a lunatic. He's perfectly sane, and he's responding, for the most part, responding to the questions and objections that are given to him properly. He understands them and everything like that. So he's a perfectly normal human being. And let's think about this. We actually have proof on this. If Gary was just some raving lunatic and making these numbers truly as an opinion off the top of his head, which is what Lydia McGrew quotes Gary saying from my interview there, if that was true and he was this raving lunatic, then why is it everyone with a PhD who reads the resurrection literature confirms, again, unlike Gary, they haven't read all of the literature that Gary has, so nobody is able to judge him. He's the world's expert. But people like Dr. William Lane Craig, Craig Keener, Mike Licona, all of these scholars, and in fact, Mike Licona has a student who's currently surveying 200 scholars as part of his PhD dissertation. They all affirm Gary absolutely is correct when he says 90% of scholars accept his minimal facts based on their readings. Now, that's impossible to be the case. There wouldn't be that correlation. If Gary was a lunatic and making it up and it had no this 90% claim head count had no basis in reality from his readings, he was just misremembering or totally getting it wrong, why does every scholar back him up and say, no, from my readings, this is true? And in fact, let's forget about those examples, because those are biased Christians, right? They like Gary, they're friends with Gary. Maybe they're just lying to back him up or something like that, not to hurt his feelings. Well, here's the rub. Even critics, people who are deliberate critics of Gary Habermas and his minimal facts approach and want to discredit his scholarly consensus. I speak of the Jewish independent researcher Michael J. Alter, who has actually done a head count in his private email with me. Again, I don't reveal private emails, so that's why I'm not going to show it. But just generally speaking, he has told me he has surveyed over 10,000 English sources to date, including articles or journal papers and books. And he has kept rigorous head counts or precise head counts. And guess what? He affirms and affirmed to me personally via private email. And he affirms this in his 2020 book, thematic observations or something like that, which Gary endorsed, where he includes 7,000 English sources. So since then, he's looked at a further 3,000 since 2020. And they all back it up. The ratio is about 12-1, are written by pro-resurrection Christian authors who accept the 6 minimal facts. That's 92.31% statistically proven, objectively, with a rigorous head count of English scholars all affirm Gary's minimal facts. And this is data from a critic backing up Gary's estimations from his literature survey there. I ask you, if Gary was deluded, a lunatic, delusional, the numbers have no basis in reality, he's all just making this up, it would be impossible for him to get this accurately correct. No, Michael Alter would have found that, only 76% back up the minimal facts and back our pro-resurrection. Gary was totally out to lunch when he said it was more than 90%. But guess what the data, objective statistical data shows and proves? Gary is bang on. His mind is sharp, and he does have a good memory. Apparently, he does remember the overall statistics of all of the papers he's read, up to 6,000 to date, 5,000 for himself, and the 1,000 from Ben Shaw. And he's right. It's over 92.31%. Incredible. Now, what about the French and English? Because Michael Alter doesn't cover those. Has he been backed up? Well, again, Mike Licona's student is studying French, English, and German sources from 200 scholars. He backs up Gary's claims. And I would estimate, Michael Alter told me in a private email that he estimates there are only about 50, from 1975 to the present, there are only about 50 papers and or sources written in French and German about the resurrection. That are I think that he qualifies as contra sources. Again, I'm not reading his email here, but let's say it's contra for a worst case scenario here. Well, once again, this is 50 books versus 6,000, or 50 sources versus 6,000. That's not going to make a dent. It's still going to be approximately 90% within Gary's range for what qualifies of the vast majority of scholars. So once again, he's bang on, even taking the critics' data. How is that possible? That is an amazing memory estimation of Gary's literature surveys. That would just be impossible if he was truly a lunatic or losing his mind because of old age, suffering from dementia of some sort. His recollections would just be totally off base if that were the case. But it's not. It's perfectly consistent. So I don't think the delusion or lunatic explanation works. So that means Gary Habermas is still the great, amazing leader of the church that we've always known for decades. And he deserves to be respected as such. Lydia McGrew is wrong to say that he's dishonest and or a lunatic. Given this data, at worst, he's someone who needs to be a bit more deliberate, more considerate, more careful, and consistent in the terminology he uses and how he describes his methodologies when he's speaking off the cuff on podcasts. He has indeed, at least through the explicit words said, contradicted himself at times, and or seemingly so, strongly implied that he's contradicted himself, and that sometimes he makes conflations of certain things that shouldn't be conflated. We saw that in Objection 2 with terminology. So, yes, Gary is a great leader. He's not perfect. He has some areas of that he should improve on or try his best to improve on, such as communicating more clearly, carefully, and in a way that's more considerate for people hearing, because the way he has communicated in the podcast has caused legitimate confusion, even among people like myself or Mike Lacona and stuff like that. You can see in his shows that sometimes we're, what do you mean by that? It causes confusion. So yes, I think Gary, my overall conclusion here, based on everything, is that Gary is a leader, but he needs to improve on his communication skills to be clearer and more cautious in what he's saying, the specifics. And again, that doesn't imply he's losing his mind or he's a lunatic or he's a deliberate liar any more than it does for me. I'm not losing my mind. I'm middle-aged kind of thing. I'm not losing my mind, and I'm not a liar. But these sorts of same things could be found in my podcasting as well. If Paulogia went searching through my thing, he would easily find clips where I selectively edit them together to make it look like, oh, I'm directly contradicting myself all the time. I gave the example of the no paint with Sturt, but there are lots of things. And it happens when you speak off the cuff. Some people are better, more precise communicators, and other people need more preparation time. Like Dr. William Lane Craig, he'll prepare 6 months before a debate. And that's great. He's well prepared, he's well studied. And I think that's preferable. That's ideal. That's better. I would prefer that. The more time I have to prepare for a debate, the better. But at the same time, I'm also flexible to take advantage of opportunities in the moment, realizing the audience should be real seekers, or ought to be, and not judging every little exact word I say in the moment when I'm speaking off the cuff. And I'm willing to take a debate. Michael Lofton invited me to a debate. I only had a week and a half to prepare for the debate against the Orthodox Muslim on the prophecies of Muhammad. And it had been since 2016 since I had looked into that. I'd forgotten everything. So I had to remind myself within a week and a half, refresh myself of all the 24 that I knew of at that time, claimed prophecies of Muhammad in the Bible, And not only that, watch debates, all this stuff to try and prepare. Okay, what are the comebacks, and do I have a response for that? I only had a week and a half to prepare for that against someone who is a specialist in that specific area of debate. They engage in Muslim Christian polemics and debates all the time, so it's fresh on their memory. They have that advantage over me, where I have to refresh my memory onto the specifics of the debate and get caught up to speed within a very short period of time. And when that happens, yeah, you're not going to remember stuff, or you're going to say something in the moment off the cuff. But I believe in taking advantage of the opportunities that arise in the moment. I kind of have a Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus. Take chances, make mistakes, get messy.
Take chances, make mistakes.
And I feel like I expect the audience, at least the real seekers. I don't care about atheists like Paulogia, where they're just looking for an excuse to disbelieve, to justify their sin. They're looking to discredit Gary, and they'll take and use anything and everything to their advantage. They don't care about the truth. Lydia and the other Christians, you don't have that excuse. You guys are duty bound to care about the truth, and I know that you do care about the truth. So on your end, you guys needed to be much more charitable than you were to Gary Habermas, and looking at the full context, listening to the primary sources, his interview with mine, not basing your opinion on Paulogia's video alone. Looking at the full context of the quotes, not just the quotes that support what you want to hear, such as him saying there's more non-Christians than Christians. We all heard those words on my interview. But if you just listen a couple minutes more, when Gary's continuing, all of a sudden it's evangelicals and non-evangelicals or terminology coming up. And that should have been your hint, should have been your tip off right there to go, maybe it's not as simplistic. We don't know what he's saying. We can't say or prove that he actually meant or intended to say this, because he's saying something totally different here. So what's the story? Maybe I'll be charitable and I'll reach out to Gary privately. That's what I did. When I had confusion, I went and asked Gary, can you clarify this? That would have been the charitable thing to do. So yeah, that's my overall conclusion, is I think the principle of charity would have been the answer to these interview-based objections. If both Lydia and the Christians like David Paulman, Jonathan McLatchie, and Colton Carlson, they needed to be more charitable to the intention, to what Gary was intending to say, and listening more for the full context, maybe even reaching out to him for clarification and consideration of his viewpoint before deciding, I think, too hastily on a heavily edited Paulogia video that Gary's dishonest and can't be trusted and stuff. That just isn't true, provably, given these examples here. And it was unwarranted on your part. By the same token, charity works both ways. I think Gary should have been more charitable to his listeners, because the confusions and the misinterpretations, uncharitable as they are on Lydia and the Christians' part, to some extent it's understandable, because Gary, as a communicator, could have been better. He could have been more charitable to the listeners and been a little bit more careful or cautious and considerate and frankly consistent. At times he's inconsistent with his terminology, for example. He could have been more clearer as a communicator, to help prevent or to mitigate against these types of misunderstandings that people are coming to. So that's my overall conclusion. I think as Christians, we need to adopt and apply the principle of charity to each other. We need Christian tribalism, because I'm not seeing it anymore. Christians in their obligations to the truth and to God, which is our number one concern. I admit that. We're not here to protect false Christians or false teachers or people who are deliberately lying and sinning in that way. Our duty as Christians is to expose that so that Christ's reputation isn't tarnished. So I get that. But at the same time, we shouldn't be too eager to find fault. We should be trying to ensure that we are getting to the truth before we judge, before we adjudicate on the matter. And for that, we need to apply the principle of charity to each other. I hope that all sides involved, especially the Christians, right? Especially Lydia and Gary and David Paulman, every Christian involved in these things. I hope that this show was edifying, and I did my best to find fault where it lied. So I was truthful that Gary was not perfect. Neither was Lydia or the other side. Both sides need to exercise a bit more charity. But at the same time, Gary has been proven to still be a stalwart leader in the church based on these evidential considerations. So that's it for this one. I will admit, Lydia does have additional, McGrew does have additional problems. She has a total of 6 videos and a couple blogs, or a few blogs, where she says that Gary in volume 1 misinterprets certain liberal scholars and misquotes them or doesn't accurately portray their views. And this would be an additional evidential consideration to factor in that we haven't done so in this part by design. I wanted to stick just with the Paulogia in my interview with Gary-based objections, but I am considering doing a part 2 where I will look at those objections from volume 1. I'm not including it here because I looked into this with Ben Shaw and Lydia McGrew behind the scenes in my own research, and I confirmed none of these problems that she mentions apply to volume 3 at all. So the problems that are in volume 1 supposedly don't transfer to volume 3. There's only one possible exception with Bart Ehrman, but I spoke that over with Ben Shaw and cleared that up. Again, I'll get into those details in the part 2. Another reason I'm wanting to wait and keep that for part 2 is there's also Michael Alter, the critic I mentioned here, mentioned to me in an email that he's going to be attacking Gary, his minimal facts approach, with Paulogia. The two have teamed up and are in cahoots a bit to give his research on Paulogia's podcast. So I want to wait for that to come out and see what's going to be said. Michael assures me, I warned him that be careful because Paulogia's goal is not truth. He just wants to bash me and Gary. So, don't fall for his tricks. I expect you to be respectful and substantive towards Gary. I respect that he's a critic of Gary Habermas. That's fine. He's allowed to share the truth as he sees it. Again, he's Jewish, not a Christian. And I support him giving his research. He's done 13 years of research, taking rigorous head counts, and he deserves to be recognized and acknowledged for his research. Like I said, I think it's actually helpful for Gary. Despite his attempts to discredit Gary's minimal facts approach, I actually think it's useful for confirming his minimal facts approach. So yeah, at least indirectly and stuff like that. But anyways, so Michael, I want to wait for that video to come out, Paulogia in cahoots with Michael Alter, and see what they raise there. And I will include a response in my part 2 to that. So it'll be Lydia McGrew's misquotation arguments, a response to the Michael Alter Paulogia team up whenever that gets published or comes out. Then I will work on a part 2 video defending Gary's legacy on that front. But yeah, that's it. God bless and Merry Christmas, everybody.